Welcome, dear listener, to Sleepy Rain Horror, where the line between dreams and nightmares blurs. As you drift into the unknown, remember that some whispers are better left unheard. But here, they're impossible to ignore. If you enjoy this tale and haven't fallen asleep yet, or are brave enough to stay awake, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. Let's see if you can make it through to the end without a single scream. It was a cold, stormy evening when Jonathan first arrived at the old house. The wind howled through the trees, and the rain lashed against the windshield as he drove along the narrow, winding road. The house was just ahead, standing dark and silent against the turbulent sky. Its shape was barely visible through the thick mist, but the towering, gnarled trees around it seemed to bow in deference, their branches reaching for the roof as if trying to pull it back into the earth. Jonathan's heart raced in anticipation, though he couldn't say exactly why. The stories the locals had shared with him echoed in his mind. Whispers of disappearances, strange noises in the dead of night, and the occasional glimpse of figures in the windows when no one was supposed to be home. Most of them had long since abandoned the idea of visiting the house. Some said it was cursed. Others claimed it was simply a place that hadn't known the light of a new day in decades. But Jonathan wasn't like the others. He wasn't scared. He had always been intrigued by the unknown, by the things that others were too frightened to confront. A part of him believed the house held secrets, things that needed to be uncovered. That was why, on this dreary evening, he decided to venture inside. The car's engine sputtered to a halt as he parked near the weathered steps that led up to the porch. The door of the house loomed in front of him like a mouth waiting to swallow him whole. Jonathan grabbed his flashlight, stepped out of the car, and made his way toward it. His boots crunched on the gravel path, the sound muffled by the pounding rain. There was something unnerving about the stillness of the air around the house, as if it had been holding its breath for years. Jonathan paused for a moment, looking back at his car parked in the driveway, its headlights dimming behind him. Then, with a steadying breath, he walked up the cracked stone steps and reached for the old door. The handle turned with a soft creak, and the door swung open on its own, the hinges protesting as though they hadn't been used in years. Jonathan stepped inside, the door slamming behind him with a finality that made his skin prickle. The air was thick with dust, and the faint smell of mildew stung his nostrils. The house had been abandoned for so long, yet it still felt alive, as though something or someone was waiting. His flashlight flickered as he swept it across the room, revealing an expansive hallway with peeling wallpaper and old portraits hung crookedly on the walls. The portraits showed families, some smiling, others with stern expressions. The eyes of the painted figures seemed to follow him, their gazes unsettling in the darkness. He stepped into the living room, the floorboards creaking beneath him. The room was massive, with an old fireplace that stretched from floor to ceiling, its stone hearth cold and abandoned. The grand chandelier overhead swayed slightly, as if disturbed by an unseen force, casting long, eerie shadows across the room. His flashlight's beam caught a few cobwebs in the corners, adding to the feeling that this place had been forgotten by time. Just a house, Jonathan muttered to himself. But even as he said it, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The whispers came suddenly, faint at first, as though carried on the wind. Jonathan paused, his breath catching in his throat. The wind outside had been howling, but this was different. It wasn't the wind. It was a voice. Several voices, muffled and distant, but undeniably present. They were speaking in low, hurried tones, overlapping one another, as if they were trying to communicate with him, but the words were indecipherable. He turned in place, trying to locate the source, but the room was still. He knew the sound hadn't come from outside, yet the house was filled with a sense of something unseen, something just beyond his perception. Jonathan laughed nervously to himself. It was the storm, he told himself. The wind, the rain, the pressure of being in such an old, isolated place. There was nothing here but decay, nothing here but the remnants of lives long past. But the whispers didn't stop. They seemed to grow louder, clearer, and more insistent. Now, Jonathan could make out a few words, though they still didn't make sense. His name was among them. A soft, breathy repetition of Jonathan, like a voice calling out from just behind him. He spun around, his flashlight beam jerking through the air, but there was no one there. Only shadows, and the silence that followed them. His pulse quickened. His mind raced to explain what was happening. He'd heard of old houses being haunted, of stories where people were driven mad by the very atmosphere of the place. Perhaps it was simply his imagination, or maybe it was something else, something he had yet to understand. He shook his head and moved further into the house, determined to push past the eerie sensations crawling over him. The hallway stretched on, dimly lit by the flickering light from his flashlight. Each step he took seemed to echo in the silence, filling the space with a hollow, unnatural sound. At the end of the hallway, there was a door. It looked no different from the others, but something about it caught his attention. It was slightly ajar, the dim glow from his flashlight revealing a sliver of the room beyond. Jonathan approached the door cautiously, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for the handle. The whispering was louder now, a low murmur that seemed to grow more frantic as he touched the knob. He hesitated, then pushed the door open, the wood groaning in protest. The room was small, almost claustrophobic, with a low ceiling and a single chair in the center. The floor was covered in dust, and the air was thick with the weight of years of neglect. But it wasn't the room itself that caused Jonathan's heart to race. It was the symbols on the walls. They were etched hastily, with uneven strokes, as though someone had been in a rush to write them down before they were stopped. The symbols seemed to pulse with an energy of their own, almost glowing faintly in the dim light of his flashlight. They were ancient-looking, like something from an old, forgotten language, and yet Jonathan recognized them. He had seen similar symbols in books about ancient rituals, protection, warding, invoking, but they had no place here, not in a house like this. And yet, there they were. Jonathan's fingers hovered over the strange symbols as if they might reach out and pull him in. His thoughts were interrupted by a sharp gust of wind that rushed through the cracks in the walls, rattling the windows and sending a chill down his spine. The whispers grew louder, louder than ever, now swirling around him like a storm of voices. They seemed to be calling him, urging him to stay, to listen. But Jonathan could feel the danger in the air. He needed to leave. He needed to get out of this house before it swallowed him whole. But as he turned to leave, a voice, clear and sharp, pierced through the chorus of whispers. Jonathan. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the house settling. The voice was coming from behind him. Jonathan froze, the voice still lingering in the air behind him. It was a low, raspy whisper, so close that he could almost feel the breath against his neck. His heart pounded in his chest, and every instinct told him to run, to flee the house and never look back. But his feet felt glued to the floor, as if the very boards beneath him had taken root, holding him in place. "Jonathan," the voice repeated, clearer now, with a slow, deliberate intonation. It wasn't just calling his name, it was summoning him. He turned around slowly, flashlight in hand, his breath shallow and uneven. There was nothing behind him, no one there. The room remained as still and silent as it had been before. The symbols on the walls seemed to mock him now, their strange lines and curves twisting as if they were alive. But there was no one else in the room. The whispering continued, though. It was no longer a single voice. It had become a chorus, an eerie ensemble of low murmurings, each tone distinct yet blending together, creating an unearthly hum that seemed to reverberate from the walls themselves. Jonathan took a step back, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. His mind raced, scrambling for an explanation. Could it be the wind? Some natural phenomenon making it seem as though the house itself was speaking? But as he looked around, he knew deep down that this was not the wind. The house was far too quiet for that, far too oppressive. The whispers weren't coming from the air, they were coming from within, as if the very walls were alive, breathing, watching. With his pulse quickening, Jonathan stumbled backward toward the door, his hand reaching for the handle. His fingers trembled as they brushed against the cold metal, but just as he was about to pull it open, he heard something that made his blood run cold. A slow, deliberate tapping sound, like fingers rapping against wood. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, closer. Jonathan turned his head, searching for the source of the noise. His flashlight flickered again, casting long, jagged shadows across the room, but there was still nothing visible. Yet, the tapping continued, echoing from the far corner of the room, as if someone, or something, was waiting in the darkness. His breath caught in his throat as he squinted into the shadows, straining his ears to listen. The tapping stopped abruptly, and for a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the rain pouring outside and his own heartbeat in his ears. Then, a soft whisper broke the silence, this time right behind him, so close that he felt the air shift. "Don't leave," it said. The voice was no longer a whisper, but a soft, almost pleading tone, laced with desperation. Jonathan spun around again, but this time, the room felt different. The temperature had dropped. His breath came out in visible puffs of mist, and the shadows in the corners seemed to stretch and grow as though they were reaching for him. There was a heaviness in the air now, a presence that he could feel pressing against him, just beyond his sight. His heart raced, and for the first time since entering the house, he began to question his decision to stay. The flashlight beam caught something in the corner, something that wasn't there before. A figure, barely visible in the darkness, standing motionless, its face hidden in shadow. Jonathan's breath hitched in his chest. His mind screamed at him to leave, to run, but his legs felt like lead, his body unwilling to obey. Use on him, watching, waiting. "Who are you?" Jonathan's voice was barely a whisper, hoarse with fear. "What do you want?" The figure didn't move, didn't speak, but the air around it seemed to shimmer, as though it were not entirely real, not entirely solid. It was as though the figure was somehow part of the house itself, a distortion in the fabric of reality. Jonathan took a step forward, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The figure remained still, its presence almost suffocating, and as he drew closer, he noticed something strange. There was no sound. The rain outside had stopped, the wind had ceased, and the house was eerily silent, save for the blood rushing in his ears. The only thing he could hear was his own breath, ragged and shallow. As he moved closer still, the figure's outline seemed to shift. It was as if the shadows around it were alive, swirling and twisting like smoke. A low growl, barely audible, resonated from within the figure, and Jonathan froze. The growl seemed to vibrate in his chest, like the sound of distant thunder, but much deeper, much darker. The figure's face was still hidden in shadow, but Jonathan felt its eyes on him. Cold, empty, eyes that seemed to pierce through him. And then, for a brief moment, he saw them. Two glowing orbs, like eyes made of pure darkness, staring back at him with a hunger that sent chills through his spine. "Leave now," the voice spoke again, this time coming from the figure itself. It was deep, guttural, as if spoken by something not quite human. "Leave, or you will never leave." The words hung in the air, thick with menace. Jonathan's stomach turned, and his legs finally obeyed. He took a step back, then another, his mind screaming at him to get out. But as he moved, the figure's eyes followed him, unblinking, as though it were not bound by time or space, as though it could reach into his very soul. He reached for the door, his hand trembling uncontrollably. But as soon as his fingers touched the handle, the house seemed to shift again. The walls groaned, the floor beneath him creaked, and the air turned suffocating, heavy with a presence that seemed to press down on him from all sides. The door wouldn't budge. Jonathan yanked at it, panic rising in his chest. "No, no, no," he muttered to himself, pulling harder, but the door was stuck, as though it were sealed from the other side. His pulse thundered in his ears, and the room seemed to close in on him, the shadows stretching toward him, growing longer, darker. "Please," he gasped, his voice breaking. "Please let me out." But the figure did not speak again. It simply watched, its hollow eyes following his every movement, waiting. And the whispers grew louder, not voices, but a cacophony of sound, like 1,000 people trapped in the walls, crying out for release, for something they had lost. Jonathan's breath came faster now, panic flooding his body. He turned, his gaze frantic, searching for another way out. But the room seemed to have changed, rearranged itself. The hallway he had entered from was gone. The walls had closed in, leaving him trapped with the figure and the whispers. The figure took a slow step forward, and as it did, the temperature dropped even further, the cold biting at his skin, making it feel as though the life was draining from him. "Leave," the voice repeated, now more insistent. "Leave now, or you will be like us." Jonathan turned back to the door, his fingers clawing at the handle, desperation clawing at his mind. But the door wouldn't open. The walls groaned, the house seemed to close in tighter, suffocating him, and the figure was moving closer, its shadow now engulfing the room. And then, just as Jonathan thought he couldn't take it any longer, the whisper returned. "Leave." It was louder now, not from the figure, but from the very walls themselves, as if the house was speaking through them, the shadows around him closing in with terrifying speed. The air was thick with the weight of the past, with the eyes of the house on him, watching, waiting. Jonathan's hand trembled as it gripped the doorknob, pulling and tugging with all his strength, but the door would not budge. His breath came in shallow gasps as panic began to seep into his mind, his heart pounding against his ribs as if it were trying to escape the very prison of his chest. The air around him felt thick, oppressive, as if the house itself was closing in on him, pushing him further into the cold, dark void. The whispers continued, now louder, more urgent, swirling in the corners of his mind. crawling under his skin, making his nerves sing with fear. The figure had taken another step forward, its presence growing heavier, like a weight pushing down on his very soul. Jonathan turned to face it, his eyes wide with terror. But the figure was still as elusive as ever, its shape shifting in and out of the shadows, its glowing eyes the only thing that remained constant. The whispers were no longer distant. They were close, so close that Jonathan could feel them vibrating in his very bones. The voices all blending together into a maddening chorus that seemed to mock his every thought. "You cannot leave," the voice from the figure said, its tone low and guttural, sending a cold shiver down Jonathan's spine. "You are ours now." Jonathan's throat tightened, his breath hitching as he fought to hold back the rising tide of fear. He turned back to the door, his hands frantic, pulling and pushing with all his might, but the door remained firmly shut. His mind raced for a solution, for anything that could get him out of this nightmare, but all he could hear were the whispers, growing louder, closer, until they were all he could focus on. "You cannot escape," they hissed, their words wrapping around him like chains. "We are everywhere." Jonathan's chest heaved with the effort to breathe, the weight of the house pressing down on him. He turned once again to face the figure, its dark silhouette now standing inches from him, the coldness of its presence making the air feel like ice. The glowing eyes bored into him, their empty depths swallowing all the light in the room. "Leave now, or stay forever," the figure whispered, its voice low and threatening. "The choice is yours." Jonathan's mind raced as his pulse quickened, but he knew there was no choice, no way out. Every instinct screamed for him to run, to find a way to break free, but his body refused to obey, as if something in the very walls of the house had taken hold of him, making him a prisoner in this place. "What do you want from me?" Jonathan's voice was hoarse, barely a whisper, but the figure did not answer. It simply watched, its glowing eyes gleaming with a hunger that chilled Jonathan to his core. The whispers in the room grew louder, more frantic, as though they were pressing in from all sides. They surrounded him, drowning him in a sea of voices, their words unintelligible but filled with malice and desperation. The floor beneath him creaked, the walls groaned, and the house seemed to shift, its very foundation trembling as if it were alive, breathing, feeding off the fear that filled the air. Jonathan's mind reeled as he tried to make sense of what was happening. How had it come to this? What was this place? Was it real? Or was he trapped in some nightmare, a dream he couldn't escape? But the more he tried to reason with himself, the more the house seemed to consume him, drawing him deeper into its darkness, its madness. The figure was now standing directly in front of him, so close that Jonathan could feel its cold breath against his face, a bone-chilling frost that made his skin prickle. The whispers were deafening now, all around him, seeping into his mind, clawing at his thoughts. "You belong to us now," the figure murmured, its voice a low, rasping hiss. "You cannot leave. You are part of the house, and we are part of you." The words struck Jonathan like a blow, and for a moment, he felt as though the ground had been ripped from beneath him. He stumbled backward, his vision blurring, and for a brief moment, he thought he might collapse. But he didn't. He fought against it, fought against the terror that threatened to consume him, pushing himself forward despite the weight of the darkness pressing down on him. He could feel it, the coldness, the presence of something ancient, something powerful, moving around him, closing in on him, its unseen fingers reaching out to drag him into its depths. He knew then that this was no ordinary house. This was something older, something far more sinister. This place was not just haunted by spirits. It was alive, a living, breathing entity that fed on fear, on despair. And Jonathan was its prey. His breath came in ragged gasps as he forced his legs to move, pulling himself away from the figure, trying to find some way to escape. But the room seemed to stretch, the walls closing in on him. The more he moved, the more the space seemed to shift, twisting and contorting, as though the very fabric of reality were warping around him. He reached for the door again, his hands slick with sweat, but it wouldn't open. The figure was still there, its eyes glowing with an intensity that made Jonathan's heart race. "You cannot leave," it repeated, its voice no longer a whisper but a command, deep and resonant. "We are here to stay, Jonathan. You are ours now." Jonathan's chest tightened as the air grew thick with the scent of decay. The whispers around him intensified, rising to a crescendo, each voice a distorted, anguished cry, filling the room, filling his mind. His vision blurred, the darkness threatening to overtake him, but he refused to give in. He couldn't. He wouldn't. There had to be a way out. He had to find it. With a burst of strength, Jonathan shoved against the door, throwing his weight into it, but the walls seemed to resist him, pushing back with an unyielding force. It was like fighting against an invisible hand, one that had been waiting for him all along. He stumbled back, disoriented, and as his eyes darted around the room, something caught his attention. The shadows. They were moving, writhing, twisting like living things, reaching toward him with long, tendril-like forms. The house itself was coming alive, its walls, its floors, its very foundation groaning and shifting as though it were waking from a long, deep slumber. Jonathan felt the blood drain from his face as he realized the truth. There was no escape. Not from this place. Not from the house. He was trapped. The whispers grew louder, merging into a single deafening roar, and Jonathan could feel his mind starting to crack under the weight of the sound, the pressure building inside his skull. The figure took another step forward, its eyes now mere inches from his face. "You should have left," it hissed, its voice low and final. "Now, you will be part of us forever." Jonathan's breath caught in his throat as the figure's hand reached out, its fingers long and skeletal, grasping for him. He backed away, but there was no place to go. The room had become a cage, and the shadows, now alive with movement, closed in from all sides. "You cannot fight it," the figure whispered. "You belong here now." The figure reached out with an unnatural speed, its cold fingers brushing against Jonathan's skin. His body went rigid, a surge of freezing cold spreading through him as though the very life was being drained from him. His vision began to fade, and the whispers grew louder, louder than ever before. And then, in the cold, suffocating darkness, Jonathan realized the truth. The house had claimed him. He had never been meant to leave. Jonathan's body felt as though it was being pulled in every direction at once, the icy fingers of the figure gripping him tighter with each passing second. The cold seeped deeper into his bones, chilling him to the core, but the most terrifying thing wasn't the cold. It was the realization that he was no longer in control of his own body, that the presence in the room had a grip on him stronger than his own will. His limbs moved with a jerky, unnatural motion, as if they were no longer his own. His heart pounded in his chest, but it was a distant sound, like the echo of a drumbeat far away. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices that drowned out everything else, their words indistinguishable but filled with an overwhelming sense of dread. He could no longer tell where the voices ended and his thoughts began, his mind blending with the darkness, the very air around him thick with the weight of their presence. "You belong here," the figure whispered again, its voice low and guttural, its cold fingers tightening around his arm, pulling him closer. "You are one of us now." Jonathan's body jerked, his muscles seizing involuntarily, and his vision blurred as the darkness seemed to fold in on him. He could feel the presence of the house all around him, the very walls vibrating with the sinister energy that had been building since he first stepped inside. It wasn't just the figure. It was the house itself, the place, the land, all of it bound together in a nightmarish union, feeding on the fear of anyone who dared to enter. "No," Jonathan gasped, his voice barely audible, the words slipping past his lips like a desperate plea. He tried to move, tried to break free, but the shadows seemed to grab at him, pulling him back toward the figure, their grip unyielding. "You cannot escape," the figure growled, its voice rising in intensity, and Jonathan could feel the cold radiating off it like a deep, unrelenting frost. "This place is your home now. You are ours." He fought against the force that held him, pushing with every ounce of strength he had left, but it was useless. His body moved as if it were no longer his own, and the darkness began to pull him into it, wrapping around him like a suffocating shroud. He could feel his breath becoming shallow, his chest tightening as the weight of the house bore down on him. The shadows that had once been mere distortions in the corners of the room now seemed to consume everything, stretching out and devouring the light, leaving him trapped in a world of blackness. He tried to scream, to call out for help, but no sound escaped his lips. His throat was constricted, and the weight of the silence in the room was almost unbearable. The whispers continued, louder now, as if they were seeping into his very soul, their cold tendrils curling around his thoughts, suffocating him from within. "You cannot run," the figure whispered, its face coming closer, its glowing eyes never leaving his. "You cannot hide from us." Jonathan's eyes darted around the room, searching for anything that might offer him a way out, but there was nothing. The walls seemed to stretch and warp, the shadows alive with movement, and the floor beneath him felt like it was shifting, twisting, changing. It was as though the house itself was alive, shifting and contorting to trap him within its clutches. He could feel his mind beginning to unravel, the edges of his sanity starting to fray as the darkness closed in. He was drowning in it, suffocating under the weight of its power. And then, just when he thought he couldn't take it anymore, the whispers grew quieter. The oppressive pressure lifted, if only for a moment, and Jonathan found himself gasping for air, his body trembling with the aftershocks of the darkness that had been pressing in on him. The figure pulled back, its cold fingers releasing him, and for a brief second, Jonathan was free. But that freedom was short-lived. A deep, resounding growl filled the air, vibrating through the walls and the floor, a sound that seemed to come from the very depths of the earth itself. The ground beneath him trembled, and the house seemed to come alive with an ancient, primal energy, as though it were awakening from a long, slumbering hibernation. Jonathan's eyes widened in terror as the shadows around him began to shift and writhe, growing more tangible, more solid. They reached out, tendrils of darkness stretching toward him, pulling at his legs, his arms, dragging him down into the floor itself. He tried to scream, but his voice was swallowed by the growl, the sound reverberating through the house, louder now, deafening. The walls groaned, the floor cracked, and the very air around him seemed to twist, warping and bending in ways that defied nature. The figure was there again, standing before him, its glowing eyes now burning with an intensity that made Jonathan's skin crawl. Its mouth, which had once been a shadow, now opened wide, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth that seemed to gleam in the dark. "You are ours," the figure hissed, its voice now a terrible, monstrous growl that echoed through the room. "And you will never leave." Jonathan's chest heaved as he fought against the shadows pulling him down, but they were too strong. The floor beneath him felt as though it were made of living stone, shifting and twisting, pulling him deeper into the house, into the very bowels of its dark heart. He could feel himself being dragged down into the ground, the cold seeping deeper into his bones, his body growing weaker with every passing second. His vision blurred, his thoughts becoming disjointed, fragmented. He couldn't think, couldn't breathe. The darkness was swallowing him whole. "Please," Jonathan gasped, his voice barely a whisper, but the figure only stared at him, its eyes glowing with an insatiable hunger. "Please let me go." The figure's lips curled into a twisted smile, its eyes burning brighter. "There is no going," it whispered, its voice dripping with malice. "Not for you. Not for anyone who enters this place. You will be part of us forever." Jonathan's body went limp, his resistance fading as the shadows continued to drag him down into the depths. His mind was a blur, his thoughts scattered like broken pieces of glass. But there was one thing he knew for certain: he would never escape. The house had claimed him, and now it was part of him. The last thing he heard was the figure's voice, echoing in the darkness, before everything faded to black. "You belong here now," it whispered one last time, and Jonathan knew, with a cold certainty, that he always would. Jonathan awoke, but not in the way he expected. The world around him was no longer solid, no longer real. It was like stepping into a dream, or perhaps more accurately, a nightmare, one from which there would be no waking. His eyes flickered open to darkness, an oppressive, suffocating darkness that seemed to cling to every part of him, weighing him down. It was as if the very air he breathed was thickened by shadows, and no matter how deeply he inhaled, he couldn't rid himself of the sensation. He tried to move, to push himself up, but his limbs felt heavy, unresponsive. The familiar weight of his body, the sensation of his own control over it, was gone. The room around him was still, eerily quiet. The only sound was the low, distant hum of something that felt both ancient and unnatural. It was the kind of sound that reverberated through the bones, vibrating at a frequency that couldn't be ignored. The air seemed to press in from all sides, and Jonathan's breath caught in his throat. The walls, if they were walls at all, loomed around him in an oppressive and disorienting manner. He tried to make sense of his surroundings, but everything seemed to shift in and out of focus, as though he were caught between two realities, one where he existed and one where he no longer did. Slowly, his vision cleared, and he saw something that made his heart stop. His surroundings weren't the same as they had been before. He was no longer in the house, or at least not the house he remembered. This place was far worse, far older. The walls were covered in layers of thick, black vines that twisted and turned in unnatural patterns. The air was dense, like a thick fog that never lifted, and the oppressive darkness seemed to pulse, as if the very space was alive. It was as if he had stepped into the bowels of the earth itself. As Jonathan tried to sit up, he realized that the ground beneath him was not solid. His hands pressed against what felt like damp, wet earth, slick with something that oozed and writhed beneath his fingers. He recoiled in horror, but there was no escape. The earth itself seemed to trap him, its grip tightening with every movement. The whispers were back. This time, they weren't just in the corners of his mind. They were everywhere, all around him, seeping through the very fabric of this place, echoing in his ears with a maddening insistence. The voices weren't distinct anymore. They were a single unified chorus of anguish and torment, an endless chant of despair that washed over him like a relentless wave. "You can never leave," they whispered. "You are part of us, part of this place, forever." Jonathan's heart hammered in his chest as he struggled against the suffocating presence of the shadows, but it was useless. He was trapped. The earth around him seemed to pulse with an unnatural life, and as he stared into the unbroken darkness, he saw something shift. It was a movement so subtle, so fleeting, that he wasn't sure if it had been real. But then a low, guttural growl broke the silence, and his eyes widened in horror. From the darkness emerged shapes, twisted, contorted figures that seemed to materialize from the shadows themselves. They were like nothing Jonathan had ever seen. Grotesque, monstrous, their forms shifting in and out of reality as though they were not fully part of this world. Their faces were hidden in the dark folds of their forms, but their eyes, their glowing eyes, were unmistakable. They burned with an otherworldly fire, and Jonathan could feel the weight of their gaze on him, as if they were watching him, judging him. "Welcome to the depths," a voice rasped from one of the shapes, a voice that sent a cold shiver down Jonathan's spine. "This is your eternity now." The creatures circled him slowly, their movements eerie and deliberate, as if savoring every moment of his fear. Jonathan's pulse raced in his ears, his heart threatening to break free from his chest as he scrambled to push himself away from them. But there was nowhere to go. The ground beneath him seemed to shift with every attempt to move, and the creatures were always there, looming just beyond his reach. "There is no escape," another voice crooned, its tone soft and sweet, but there was nothing kind about it. "You belong to us, Jonathan, forever." The voices of the creatures blended together, creating a haunting melody of torment that filled the space around him. Jonathan felt himself suffocating under the weight of their presence, his body trembling uncontrollably as he tried to hold onto his last threads of sanity. He tried to scream, but his voice was lost in the swirling blackness, swallowed by the darkness that pressed in from all sides. "No!" Jonathan screamed again, his voice raw with panic. "I won't be part of this. I won't stay here." But his words had no power. They were just more noise in the endless void, nothing more than whispers that were quickly consumed by the dark. The creatures, those terrible things that now surrounded him, seemed to revel in his fear. They circled him like vultures, their glowing eyes watching him with something like amusement, as though they were waiting for him to break. And then, as if in response to his defiance, the darkness itself seemed to react. It pulsed, rhythmically, like a beating heart. The ground trembled beneath him, and Jonathan felt a sickening sensation of being pulled down, drawn into the very earth itself. The figures grew closer, their faces now visible, though the sight of them made Jonathan's stomach turn. Their faces were blank slates, smooth and featureless, but their eyes, those eyes, held all the malice, all the hunger that this place had ever known. "This is your punishment," one of the figures whispered, its voice low and dripping with venom, "for your defiance, for seeking to escape." Jonathan's mind reeled. Escape? Had he been trying to escape all along? Or had this place always been his destiny? The house, the darkness, the whispers, it was all part of something larger, something older. It was as if the world had been waiting for him, pulling him toward this moment. It had been his fate all along. The figure leaned closer, its featureless face hovering just inches from Jonathan's. The darkness seemed to pulse around them both, thickening, growing heavier. "You are part of the darkness now," it whispered, its voice like ice. "There is no more light, only us." Jonathan's body trembled, his mind racked with the realization that he had been consumed by this place. No matter how hard he fought, how desperately he tried to claw his way out, he would never escape. The very air was alive with darkness. The earth beneath him seemed to shift and change with every breath, and the creatures that surrounded him were the embodiment of everything he feared. The whispers intensified, and Jonathan felt himself sinking deeper, deeper into the darkness, until all that was left was his own terrified breathing, the cold pulse of the world around him, and the promise that there would be no escape. One autumn evening, a group of friends, Mia, Alex, Lucas, and Nora, were traveling through the countryside on a camping trip. Drawn by curiosity and a desire to explore, they ventured off the main road, following an old, overgrown trail. When they stumbled upon the ruins of Willowbrook Manor, they had no idea of the terror lying dormant beneath its crumbling walls. The manor stood silent, a skeletal reminder of a dark past. The windows were broken, the door barely hanging on its hinges, and vines crept over every surface, as if nature itself were trying to swallow the building whole. Mia, the most adventurous of the group, suggested they go inside, eager to explore the ruins and perhaps snap a few photos. The others hesitated, sensing a heavy presence around the manor, a chill that ran down their spines. But Mia's enthusiasm was infectious, and they found themselves following her inside, drawn into the eerie silence of Willowbrook. The entrance hall was dark, shadows clinging to every corner, the air thick with a damp, musty smell. Their footsteps echoed in the stillness, each sound amplified, as though the walls themselves were listening. As they moved deeper into the manor, they found strange markings on the walls, symbols that looked like they were scratched in haste, messages left behind by someone in a desperate attempt to communicate. Some were barely legible, but the words trapped and helped sent shivers down their spines. Alex, the skeptic, brushed it off as graffiti left by previous visitors, but Nora felt a gnawing unease growing inside her. The markings seemed too deliberate, too frenzied. She tried to voice her concerns, but Mia dismissed them, insisting they explore further. As they ventured down a narrow hallway, Lucas noticed something peculiar, a faint, rhythmic sound, like footsteps coming from somewhere deep within the manor. At first, he thought it was an echo, but the sound was steady, relentless, and it seemed to be getting closer. "Do you guys hear that?" Lucas whispered, his voice barely audible. The others paused, listening. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they seemed to come from right behind them. They turned, expecting to see someone, but the hallway was empty. A chill ran down Mia's spine, and she laughed nervously, trying to brush it off as a trick of their imagination. But the footsteps didn't stop. A shadow moved at the edge of their vision, darting down a side corridor. Lucas, heart pounding, decided to follow, convinced it was just a stray animal. But as he rounded the corner, he found the hallway empty, stretching into darkness. The air grew colder, the silence deeper, and an oppressive feeling settled over him, making it hard to breathe. When he rejoined the group, his face was pale, his hands trembling. "There's something here," he whispered, barely able to speak. "Something watching us." They decided to leave, their excitement replaced by a growing sense of dread. But as they retraced their steps, they found themselves lost, the corridors seeming to twist and change, leading them deeper into the heart of Willowbrook. Panic set in as they realized they couldn't find the way out. Every turn seemed to bring them back to the same room, the same shadow-filled hallway. Nora tried calling for help, her voice echoing in the silence, but no answer came. Instead, the whispers began, soft at first, like the rustling of leaves. The voices were faint, indistinct, filling the air around them, weaving through the darkness. They strained to listen, trying to make sense of the words, but the whispers grew louder, overlapping, merging into a cacophony of sorrow and anger. The symbols on the walls began to glow faintly, illuminating the hallway with an eerie, greenish light. Shadows writhed along the walls, taking shape, twisting into distorted figures, their faces frozen in expressions of agony. Mia stumbled back, her eyes wide with terror as one of the figures reached out, its hand passing through her like a cold breeze, leaving her gasping for breath. Desperate to escape, they ran through the corridors, each hallway leading them deeper into the manor's labyrinthine layout. The voices grew louder, the shadows more insistent, as though the manor itself was alive, hungry, feeding off their fear. Lucas stumbled, falling to his knees, and for a moment, he thought he saw Isaac's face staring back at him from the shadows, his eyes filled with sorrow. "You need to leave," a voice whispered, soft but urgent, "before it takes you." But no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't find the exit. The manor twisted around them, trapping them, its walls closing in like a cage. Alex, exhausted and terrified, collapsed against a wall, his hands clutching his head as the whispers grew unbearable, filling his mind with visions of darkness and despair. Just when they thought all hope was lost, Mia noticed a faint light flickering at the end of a corridor. She led the group toward it, desperate for any sign of escape. The light grew brighter as they approached, revealing a doorway, old and heavy, with strange symbols carved into its wood. Nora hesitated, sensing an intense, dark energy radiating from the door, but Mia pushed it open, revealing a chamber lit by a dim, unnatural glow. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, and upon it rested a tattered, ancient book. Jonathan's senses dulled as he sank deeper into the abyss, the pull of the darkness relentless. The creatures surrounded him now, their movements slow and deliberate, and Jonathan could feel their presence pressing in from every angle, their cold eyes burning into him. There was no escape. His limbs felt numb, as though his very body was becoming one with the earth beneath him. His chest constricted as the air grew thicker, the whispers growing louder, almost deafening. They came from all directions, swirling around him like an endless storm. "You cannot fight this," the voice came again, close and echoing, as if it was inside his mind. "This is your fate." His mind, once sharp and clear, felt heavy and unfocused, the weight of the darkness around him pulling at his thoughts. His body was numb, but his heart still raced, thumping in his chest like the beat of a drum. He could feel it, the pulse of the place. The air around him was thick with the weight of something ancient, something powerful. The creatures moved in closer, their movements synchronized like a twisted dance, closing in on him. Jonathan could feel their cold, intangible touch brushing against his skin, sending chills down his spine. The oppressive heat of the space enveloped him, suffocating him with its weight. "Why are you still here?" another voice hissed, its tone sharp and venomous. The creature's form twisted and shuddered as it leaned in close to Jonathan. "You should have let go. It would have been easier." Jonathan tried to back away, but his body refused to obey. The ground beneath him shifted again, and the creature's cold eyes never left him. The very earth seemed to bend and twist in unnatural ways, and the air grew thick with an unbearable silence. The whispering voices started to fade, leaving only the steady rhythm of his own breathing. which seemed far too loud in the void. The creatures stood still now, their movements almost imperceptible, their gazes locked onto Jonathan. "It's too late," one of them spoke again, its voice low and raspy. "You can't escape the house. You never could." Jonathan's chest tightened, his heart pounding painfully against his ribs. His eyes darted around, looking for some way to break free, but the room, if it was even a room, was a twisted, shifting maze of shadows and distorted shapes. Nothing seemed real, and yet everything felt horribly real at the same time. He felt the ground beneath him shifting again, this time sinking lower, pulling him deeper into the earth. The air was heavy with the scent of damp soil and decay. The creatures were silent now, their forms stretching and rippling, the shadows around them thickening. Jonathan felt himself being dragged further into the ground, his body slipping down into the wet earth as if the very soil was hungry for him. His breath came in sharp gasps as he tried to pull himself free, his hands grasping at the earth, but it was futile. The soil was soft and wet, clinging to his skin, refusing to let go. Every movement he made seemed to pull him deeper into the dark, the creatures still circling him, their eyes glowing brighter, intensifying with every passing second. "You belong to this place," the voice came again, a deep, guttural rasp. "You always have. You always will." Jonathan's breath quickened as he felt the pressure building around him, the suffocating grip of the earth pulling him further down. The creatures were getting closer again, their bodies looming over him, their movements like shadows, indistinct and yet all-encompassing. The air was growing colder, and he could feel his skin growing numb as the cold seeped into his very bones. The creatures watched him intently, as if savoring his struggle. "There is no escape," one of them whispered softly, its voice almost gentle. "You can fight, you can scream, but it won't change anything." The world around Jonathan seemed to distort again, the ground beneath him warping, and for a moment, he thought he saw something else, a glimpse of something far worse, something darker, deeper than he could ever comprehend. It was a flash, brief but intense, a glimpse into the heart of the place he was trapped in. The ground shifted beneath him once more, and Jonathan found himself falling, the creatures still standing silently, their eyes unblinking. He could hear the earth creaking as it swallowed him whole, and with each passing second, the darkness closed in tighter, its cold grip becoming suffocating. The world around him was falling away, crumbling like sand slipping through his fingers. The silence was unbearable now, and Jonathan felt himself slipping, losing his grip on reality, his thoughts becoming muddled. The weight of everything around him, the suffocating presence of the creatures, the crushing weight of the earth beneath him. It was all too much. His body went limp, and for a moment, he thought he could finally let go, sink into the abyss and escape the terror. But just as that thought crossed his mind, something sharp and cold grabbed his wrist. The creatures were still there, still watching, their eyes filled with an insatiable hunger. "You cannot escape," one of them whispered, its voice cold and final. "This is your home now, your eternity." The ground beneath Jonathan trembled, and he felt himself being pulled deeper, the earth parting around him like some monstrous mouth opening to swallow him whole. The creatures moved again, their forms flickering in and out of sight as they encircled him, their eyes glowing brighter than ever. Jonathan could no longer tell where the darkness ended and the creatures began. They were one and the same, their forms shifting and melding with the shadows, the very air around him alive with their presence. As she explores, she hears footsteps echoing down the halls, soft at first but growing louder, closer. She turns, shining her flashlight down the corridor, but sees only empty darkness. Her hand trembles slightly, but she forces herself to continue, convinced that she is close to finding something significant. Eventually, Evelyn reaches the library, a grand but decayed room filled with shelves of rotting books. In the center stands a pedestal with an old, dusty tome, its pages yellowed with age. As she opens it, the words seem to shift and blur, and she realizes it's written in a language she cannot understand. The whispers around her grow louder, the air growing thick and heavy. Shadows dance along the walls, figures that seem to watch her, their faces frozen in expressions of despair. She reads a few lines from the tome, words she doesn't recognize but that seem to resonate within her, filling her with a deep sense of dread. Suddenly, the room grows colder, and a figure appears in the corner, half hidden in the shadows. Evelyn gasps, stepping back, but the figure doesn't move. Its form is faint, like a ghostly outline, its face a mask of sorrow. She recognizes it from descriptions she'd read in her research. It's Isaac, the manor's former caretaker, a soul trapped within these walls. "Why have you come here?" His voice is barely a whisper, but it fills the room, each word weighted with despair. Evelyn hesitates, struggling to find her voice, before answering, "I'm here for answers, for the truth." Isaac's face twists in sorrow, his form flickering like a candle about to be extinguished. "There is no truth here," he murmurs. "Only pain, only shadows. Leave while you still can." But Evelyn can't turn back now. Driven by a need to understand, she presses Isaac for answers, asking him about the manor's curse, about the souls trapped within its walls. He begins to speak, his voice soft but clear, recounting the tale of Willowbrook, of Eleanor and the rituals that bound them all to this place. As Isaac speaks, the shadows around them grow darker, the whispers rising to a deafening pitch. Evelyn clutches her journal, taking frantic notes, her mind racing as she tries to piece together the fragments of the story. She learns of the ancient amulet, of the heart of Willowbrook, and realizes that the curse may be far older than anyone suspected. Just as Isaac finishes his tale, his form begins to fade, his voice barely audible over the chorus of whispers. "Destroy the heart," he says, his voice a mere echo. "It's the only way to free us all." Before she can respond, he disappears, leaving her alone in the darkness. The whispers grow louder, filled with desperation and anger, as if the manor itself has sensed her intentions. Evelyn feels a cold hand brush against her shoulder, and she stumbles back, her flashlight flickering as shadows close in around her. Determined, she sets off in search of the chamber where the amulet is rumored to be hidden. The manor seems to twist and shift around her, its layout confusing, as though it's trying to mislead her. Hallways she thought were familiar lead her in circles. Rooms she entered before now look foreign, each corner hiding a new terror. At last, she finds herself in a dimly lit chamber, the air thick with the stench of decay. In the center of the room stands the pedestal, and on it rests the amulet, pulsing with a dark, unnatural light. Evelyn approaches it slowly, her heart pounding, her hand reaching out to touch it. The moment her fingers brush against the amulet, she is flooded with memories. Visions of the manor's past, of Eleanor's rituals, of the countless souls bound to Willowbrook. She feels their pain, their fear, their despair, and she realizes the weight of what she holds. But before she can destroy the amulet, the shadows in the room coalesce, forming the shape of Eleanor herself. Her face is pale, her eyes empty, her voice a hollow echo as she speaks. "You think you can end this?" Eleanor's voice is cold, mocking. "This place is mine. These souls are mine. And now, so are you. Evelyn stares at Eleanor, her grip on the amulet tightening. She feels the darkness pressing in on her, the weight of the souls trapped within the manor, all crying out for release. Summoning every ounce of courage, she raises the amulet above her head, determined to break it, to free the souls bound to Willowbrook. But Eleanor's form solidifies, her shadowy hands reaching out to stop her. Evelyn struggles, feeling the cold grip of Eleanor's fingers wrapping around her, pulling her into the darkness. The room spins, the shadows merging, the whispers rising to a crescendo as she fights to keep hold of the amulet. With a final surge of strength, she brings the amulet down, shattering it against the stone floor. A blinding light fills the room, and she hears the anguished screams of Eleanor, of the souls bound to the manor, as they are released from their prison. The light fades, and Evelyn finds herself alone, the chamber silent, the air still. The manor's oppressive presence has lifted, the shadows gone, the whispers silenced. She feels a profound sense of peace, a weight lifted from her shoulders as she realizes that the curse has finally been broken. As she makes her way out of the manor, the rain has stopped, and the first light of dawn breaks over the horizon. The ruins of Willowbrook stand silent, a place of horror now laid to rest. Evelyn leaves, her heart heavy with the knowledge of the souls she has freed, and with a vow to ensure that Willowbrook's story is finally told, its secrets brought to light. In the years that follow, Willowbrook is forgotten, reclaimed by the forest, its dark history fading into legend. And on quiet nights, when the rain falls softly, those who wander near might still hear faint whispers on the wind, the final echoes of the souls who were once bound within its walls, their voices a testament to a past now at peace. Decades after the events at Willowbrook Manor, the forest reclaimed the land, shrouding the ruins in a dense, almost impenetrable blanket of greenery. To all who lived nearby, the stories of Willowbrook had all but faded into obscurity, relegated to local folklore. Yet, there was one person who couldn't let go of the manor's legacy, a man named Adrian, an archivist who had come across Evelyn's journal while sorting through a box of forgotten documents. Evelyn's journal was filled with her frantic notes and descriptions of her experiences within Willowbrook Manor. Adrian was captivated by her account of the curse, the amulet, and the souls that had haunted the walls. And though Evelyn's last entry seemed to conclude her story, Adrian felt that there was more, that some secrets remained hidden within the manor's ruins. Adrian couldn't ignore the pull, the haunting curiosity that grew with each page he read. He began to research Willowbrook, digging through historical records, scouring maps, piecing together the fragmented past of the manor and its inhabitants. The deeper he delved, the more obsessed he became, until, finally, he felt compelled to see Willowbrook for himself. On a cold, mist-laden morning, Adrian set off into the forest, clutching Evelyn's journal as a guide. Rain began to fall, lightly at first, then harder, each drop echoing like the whisper of a ghost as he followed the overgrown path to the manor. The ruins appeared before him, almost hidden by trees and vines, standing in eerie silence. Adrian felt a strange energy in the air, as though the manor itself was alive, watching, waiting. He entered the manor, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. With each step, his flashlight illuminated fragments of the past, cracked walls, broken furniture, and faded symbols etched into the stone. He felt a chill run down his spine as he passed through the hallways, the oppressive silence pressing in on him. The whispers began, faint at first, barely discernible from the sound of the rain, but growing louder as he moved deeper into the ruins. Jonathan's senses were slipping away, and with them, his last grip on reality. The creatures circled him like vultures, their eyes glowing brighter, their shapes warping and shifting with every flicker of the darkness. His body was sinking deeper into the earth, swallowed by the weight of the soil, the suffocating presence of the darkness pressing in from all sides. The air was thick, impossibly heavy, and it seemed to crush him with every breath he took. His chest burned as he tried to draw in air, but it felt like his lungs were filled with lead. The shadows around him stretched and twisted, impossibly long, and he could feel the pull of them, dragging him deeper into the earth. He fought against it, his muscles straining, but his strength was fading. His mind felt like it was unraveling, slipping further into confusion as the whispers grew louder, more frantic. "You can't escape," they hissed in unison. "There is no escape from this place." Jonathan's heartbeat thudded in his ears, each beat like a drum, but it was growing weaker. His limbs were growing heavier, slower, as if they were no longer his own. The creature's movements were slow, deliberate, as if savoring the moment. "You belong here," one of them whispered softly, its voice like ice. "You always have." The word sent a chill down Jonathan's spine, and his mind tried to grasp for any sliver of hope, any way to break free, but there was nothing. The darkness was all-consuming, and he was sinking into it with every passing second. His body no longer felt real, as though it were fading into the shadows with him. His thoughts were no longer his own, swept away by the unrelenting pull of the earth. The creatures hovered around him, their glowing eyes like pits of fire, watching him as if they were waiting for something. Jonathan's vision blurred, and he could no longer tell where his body ended and the earth began. It all felt like one endless mass of darkness, a place where time had no meaning, where existence itself had no form. "This is your eternity," a voice whispered, so close to his ear that it felt like the very words were etched into his soul. "There is nothing else." Jonathan's mind flashed back to the house, to the moment he had first felt the pull of this place. It had been gradual, subtle at first, just a few strange occurrences, an odd feeling of being watched, the whispers in the dark. But now it all made sense. He had never truly escaped. This house, this place, had always been a part of him. His body was no longer his own. It was part of the darkness, part of the creatures, part of the earth that consumed him. His eyes, once wide with terror, now seemed to glaze over, the horror no longer overwhelming, but dull and final. "There is no light here," the voice continued, its tone heavy with finality. "No escape, no salvation, only darkness." Jonathan's eyes fluttered, his vision darkening as the creatures closed in, their forms blurred with the shadows, their eyes now the only thing he could see, glowing brighter with each passing second. He tried to speak, to scream, but his voice was lost in the crushing silence of the place. His body, now submerged deep within the earth, felt as though it was no longer part of the world he had known. The creature's cold eyes followed him, their shapes warping and shifting, becoming one with the dark, indistinguishable from the shadows themselves. There was no light, no warmth, no escape. "You will never leave," the creatures whispered, their voices merging into a single eerie chant. "You are part of this place now, forever." And as Jonathan's last breath left his body, the shadows closed in, and his form was swallowed by the earth. He was gone, a part of the darkness, lost to the house and the creatures that inhabited it. The whispers died away, and for a moment there was silence. The earth seemed to still, as if it were waiting, watching. And then, Somewhere deep within the bowels of the house, another soul joined the endless cycle, another victim lost to the darkness. The house remained, its walls pulsating with a slow rhythm of time, a silent witness to the countless souls it had claimed. The creatures still watched, their glowing eyes waiting for the next victim to arrive, their whispers echoing through the endless corridors of darkness. The house, the creatures, the earth itself. Everything was part of the same unbroken, eternal cycle. And in the end, there was no escape. There would never be escape. The earth lay still, silent, as if nothing had ever happened. The air was thick with a suffocating stillness that felt like the pause between breaths. But in the depths of the house, where Jonathan had been consumed, something shifted. A flicker of movement. A whisper. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, like the faint rustling of dead leaves in the wind. But the house, the creatures, the darkness itself seemed to respond to it. The earth trembled, just the slightest shiver beneath the surface. And in that fleeting moment, something ancient stirred. The creatures were not gone. They had never left. They had been waiting, watching in silence, as they always did. They had seen hundreds of souls come and go. They had witnessed the slow, inevitable descent of each victim, each lost soul that wandered into the house, drawn by its dark allure. But they had never forgotten Jonathan. He was one of them now. He had joined the endless cycle, lost to the earth, bound to the darkness. And as the flicker of movement spread across the shadows, a strange new force began to take shape. In the heart of the house, in the very bowels of the earth, a sound broke the silence. A soft, quiet thud, almost like the beat of a heart. And then another. The rhythmic sound of something alive, something breathing, beating within the darkness. The creatures, still in their shifting forms, turned their heads in unison, their glowing eyes scanning the shadows, their senses heightened. Something was different. From the shadows, from the deepest crevices of the earth, a figure emerged. It was not human, but it was something more, something older, more twisted. The figure stood tall, its form cloaked in darkness, its shape obscured by a thick fog that swirled around it like a shroud. Its eyes glowed with an eerie light, not like the cold, predatory eyes of the creatures, but with a deep, unnatural fire. A fire that seemed to burn with the very essence of the house itself. The creatures recoiled, their forms flickering as the figure moved closer. They had never seen anything like this before. The figure spoke, but its voice was not like the whispers of the creatures. It was louder, more powerful, resonating deep within the bones of anyone who heard it. The cycle is broken, it said, its voice a deep, guttural rumble, echoing through the earth. The darkness has claimed what it needs. Now it is time for something more. The creatures trembled at the sound of the voice, their eyes flashing with fear. This was no ordinary entity. This was something they had been waiting for, something older than the house itself. The figure turned its gaze to the spot where Jonathan had once stood, where his body had been consumed by the earth. A low, chilling laugh emanated from its form, a sound that was both human and otherworldly, echoing in the vast emptiness of the house. Another soul, it whispered, its voice almost tender, but not the last. There will always be more. The creatures gathered around the figure, their movements slow, uncertain. They watched it, their glowing eyes filled with a mix of reverence and fear. The figure stood unmoving, its gaze fixed on the earth beneath it. The darkness around it seemed to swirl, thickening, as if responding to its presence. "You think you control this place," the figure continued, its voice laced with mockery. You think you own it, but you are merely its servants. The true power lies beneath, in the heart of the earth, in the soul of this house. The ground trembled again, and the creatures stiffened. They had never heard such words before. They had always been the masters here, the ones who controlled the fate of every soul that wandered into the house. But now, in the presence of this figure, they felt a deep, instinctual fear. The figure's form began to shift, its shadowy outline warping as it grew taller, its presence expanding. The very air seemed to crackle with energy, thick and oppressive. The creatures backed away, their glowing eyes now wide with terror. They knew, deep down, that this was not something they could control. It was something ancient, something beyond their understanding. Do not be afraid, the figure said, its voice cold and commanding. I am not here to destroy. I am here to renew, to change, to bring forth a new era. The creatures hesitated, their movements uncertain. They had always been part of the darkness, part of the house, but this figure, this presence, was something entirely different. It was not bound by the same rules that had governed the house for so long. It was something else entirely. And then, in a single fluid motion, the figure extended a hand toward the ground, its fingers brushing lightly over the earth. The soil trembled beneath it, and a low, rumbling sound filled the air. The creatures stared in disbelief as the earth around them began to shift and change. The very foundation of the house seemed to buckle and bend, as if the walls themselves were alive, responding to the figure's will. The darkness deepened, the shadows stretching and twisting around them. The house itself seemed to groan, its ancient walls cracking and crumbling, as if it were waking from a long, stagnant sleep. The creatures watched, paralyzed, as the figure raised its other hand, and the earth around them began to break apart like a great yawning mouth. The ground split open, and a deep, hollow echo filled the air. It was the sound of something ancient awakening, something that had been dormant for centuries, perhaps millennia. The figure turned its gaze back to the creatures, its eyes glowing with a fierce intensity. You have served your purpose, it said softly, its voice a mere whisper now, barely audible over the rumbling of the earth. Now it is time for something new. The creatures, once so confident in their control, felt the ground beneath them begin to shift again. Their forms flickered, their movements slow and jerky, as if they were being pulled into the earth. One by one, they disappeared into the cracks that had opened, swallowed by the darkness, their bodies consumed by the very house they had once ruled. And then, silence. The earth lay still once more, but the house was different now. The oppressive weight of the darkness had lifted, replaced by an eerie calm. The figure stood alone in the center, its glowing eyes burning with the power it had unleashed. It was no longer just a shadow in the dark. It was the heart of the house itself, its true master. And as the last remnants of the creatures faded into the earth, the figure spoke once more. Now the house belongs to me. And in the deep, hollow silence, the echoes of the old darkness were gone, replaced by the promise of something new. The house had transformed. Where once the oppressive darkness had reigned, now there was only stillness, an unsettling calm that permeated every inch of the once twisted halls. The creatures, the ancient beings that had once thrived within its walls, were no more. They had been consumed, swallowed by the earth that had birthed them, and in their place, the figure stood alone, its presence vast and overwhelming, radiating an energy that seemed to pulse with the heartbeat of the house itself. Its glowing eyes, now steady and unblinking, scanned the silent corridors, the rooms that had once echoed with the whispers of the lost. It was as if the house itself had exhaled, releasing a long-held breath, and now it waited, expectant, for something new to take its place. The figure moved through the halls with a slow, deliberate grace, its form shifting and warping as it passed through walls and floors, as though the very fabric of the house had bent to its will. The dark corners that had once concealed horrors now seemed empty, lifeless. There was no longer a presence there, no feeling of being watched. The house was no longer a prison. It was a canvas, waiting to be painted with a new, darker reality. The figure paused in front of a mirror, its reflection a distortion of shadow and light. It smiled, its teeth sharp and gleaming in the dim glow of its eyes. It had not just claimed the house, it had become it. It was the house now, its soul intertwined with the very foundation that had been built upon the suffering of so many. Its power flowed through every crack in the walls, every whisper of wind that passed through the broken windows. The darkness had been its strength, but now it was something more. The figure turned away from the mirror, its movements fluid, as if it were one with the house itself. It knew what it needed to do. There would be no more waiting, no more watching from the shadows. The time had come to fulfill its true purpose. With a snap of its fingers, the air around it shifted, crackling with energy. The very walls of the house seemed to groan, as if awakening from a long slumber. The ground trembled beneath its feet, and the windows shattered, sending shards of glass scattering across the floor. The house was alive again, but this time it was different. This time it was not just a place of death and despair, it was a place of rebirth. The figure spread its arms wide, its form glowing brighter as the power surged through it. The air grew thick with anticipation, and for the first time in centuries, the house seemed to breathe, pulsing with life. From the cracks in the walls, from the broken windows, shadows began to seep out, creeping along the floors, wrapping around the figure like a cloak. They were not the same shadows that had once roamed the halls. They were new, different, born from the very essence of the house itself. They swirled around the figure, twisting and contorting, taking shape. And then, in a flash of light, the shadows solidified. They were no longer just whispers of darkness. They had become something tangible, something that could move, that could act. The figure smiled again, its eyes gleaming with satisfaction. It had done it. It had brought forth something new, something that would replace the creatures that had once haunted these halls. These new beings were born of the house, of its power, and they would serve the figure in ways the creatures never had. The house was alive, and it was hungry. The figure's smile grew wider as it felt the presence of the new shadows, its creations, gather around it. They were waiting for instructions, ready to carry out its will. It was not a king, not a ruler, but something more. It was the essence of the house itself, the embodiment of its darkness, its hunger, and its power. And now it would feed. The figure turned and walked deeper into the house, its footsteps echoing through the halls. The shadows followed, moving like a wave of black ink, swallowing everything in their path. There was no more room for hesitation, no more time for reflection. The house had chosen its new master, and the figure would ensure that it remained in control. Every inch of the house was now part of it. Its walls, its floors, its very foundation. The figure was not bound by the constraints of time or space. It could move through the house as it wished, its form shifting, expanding, becoming one with its domain. The house was its kingdom, and it would stretch out into the world beyond. The figure reached a door at the end of the hall, its hand pressing against the cold wood. With a single push, it opened, and beyond it, there was nothing but darkness. The house had no limits. It was infinite, ever-expanding, a labyrinth of endless corridors and rooms, all designed to trap those who dared to enter. And now, with the creatures gone and the darkness reborn, the house would grow. Its power would spread, infecting the world outside, pulling in new souls to feed its insatiable hunger. The figure stepped into the darkness, the shadows following closely behind. It could feel the pull of the world beyond, the pulse of life beating just outside the walls. It could hear the whispers of those who had heard the stories, those who had heard the rumors of the house, but had never believed. They would come. They always did. And when they did, the house would be waiting. The figure's laugh echoed through the endless corridors, a sound of pure malice, of satisfaction. It had done what it came to do. It had broken the cycle. It had made the house its own. And now it would watch. It would wait. And when the time was right, it would feed again, and the darkness would grow. Time passed in the house, but it was no longer measured by days or nights. The very fabric of time had been distorted, warped by the figure's presence. The house no longer adhered to the laws of the outside world. It existed in its own twisted dimension, where nothing could escape and nothing could enter unless invited. The figure remained at the heart of it all, its essence now intertwined with the house's very structure. It was not a mere inhabitant, but the soul of the place, and the house was a living extension of its will. The shadows it had birthed moved through the rooms, crawling along the walls, waiting patiently for the arrival of the next souls. The figure had made the house a beacon, its power now radiating outward, calling to those who were weak, lost, or curious. It was not long before the first group of strangers arrived. They were drawn to the house by its pull, each of them unaware of the fate that awaited them. Some came seeking refuge from a storm, others searching for an adventure, but all were bound for the same end. They stood before the house, staring up at its tall, imposing structure, unsure of what they were about to enter. The rain began to fall harder as they knocked on the door, their faces reflecting a mixture of fear and intrigue. The door creaked open slowly, and from within came a voice, smooth and deep, inviting them in. They hesitated for only a moment, but curiosity overcame them. They stepped across the threshold, unaware that they were crossing into the domain of something far darker than they could comprehend. Inside, the house was alive with a presence they could not identify. The air was thick with a strange, oppressive weight. The shadows moved, but they didn't quite touch the ground. They floated just inches above the floor, as if watching, waiting. The figures stepped further in, hearing the faintest whisper of movement, but when they turned, no one was there. The house felt alive, pulsing with an energy they could not explain. They moved cautiously, following the strange trail of light that seemed to guide them deeper into the heart of the house. The walls groaned and shifted around them, as if the house itself were breathing. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to grow longer with every step. Suddenly, a figure appeared in front of them, standing tall and still. The figure was cloaked in darkness, its form shifting and undulating like smoke. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and its presence felt like a weight pressing down on their very souls. "Welcome," it said, its voice both soothing and unnerving, resonating deep within their chests. "The house has been waiting for you." The strangers froze, a chill running down their spines. They didn't know why, but they felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if something was terribly wrong. The figure did not move, but its eyes followed them, its gaze never leaving them. It was studying them, evaluating their worth, deciding who would be consumed first. The house could wait, but the hunger within it could not. "You are safe," the figure continued, its voice laced with a strange calmness. "For now." The strangers exchanged uncertain glances. One of them, a young woman named Clara, stepped forward. She was drawn to the figure's presence, her curiosity overpowering her fear. "What is this place?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. The figure smiled, though it was a smile that sent a wave of coldness through her body. "This place is beyond your understanding. It is a place where the past and future meet, a place where time is irrelevant. You have entered my domain now, and there is no turning back." The figure extended its hand, beckoning them to follow. The shadows around them seemed to move in response, slithering like living things, guiding them down the corridor. Clara and her companions hesitated but found themselves compelled to follow. It felt as though they had no choice. As they walked, they noticed the house seemed to stretch, its walls shifting and changing around them, as though the rooms themselves were alive. There was no escape. The house had already claimed them. The further they ventured into its depths, the more distorted the air became, the heavier the silence. And then the whispers began. At first, they were faint, like a distant hum, but they grew louder with every step. They couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was a warning, a cry for help. They quickened their pace, their fear growing, but the shadows only grew thicker. The walls seemed to close in on them, pressing down, suffocating them. Clara looked back, but the way they had come was gone. There was no turning back now. "Where are we going?" one of the strangers asked, his voice shaky. "This is the heart of the house," the figure answered, its voice now a low, resonating hum. "Where all things come to rest." The words hung in the air, thick with meaning. The heart of the house. They had arrived at the source of its power. The figure led them to a grand hall, its walls adorned with strange symbols, carved deep into the stone. The floor was cold beneath their feet, smooth and unyielding. At the center of the room stood a large, circular stone, cracked and weathered by centuries of use. The shadows that surrounded them coalesced around the stone, forming shapes that were indistinct but full of movement. The air grew heavier still, pressing down on them, suffocating them with an invisible weight. The figure raised its arms, and the shadows followed, swirling around it in a slow, hypnotic dance. "You have arrived," the figure said, "and now the feast begins." It was then that Clara realized, with growing horror, that the whispers had stopped. The silence was deafening now. They were not the ones meant to consume. They were the ones to be consumed. The shadows lunged at them, swirling around their bodies, pulling them into the cold stone floor. Clara screamed, her voice swallowed by the darkness. The figure stood, watching with cold amusement as the shadows devoured the souls of those who had wandered too far into the house. There was no escape. There never had been. The house was alive, and it was hungry. The figure smiled as it felt the souls feed the hunger, feeding the house itself. This was only the beginning. The feast would never end. The echoes of the screams were barely a whisper now, swallowed by the thick walls of the house. The shadows, now sated with the souls of the newcomers, returned to their place within the very structure of the house. The figure stood in the center of the room, its eyes glowing brighter, its smile wide with satisfaction. It had consumed once more, but the hunger was never fully quenched. The house had been fed, but it would always hunger again. It would always need more. As the shadows dissipated into the walls, the house seemed to settle, like a great beast after feeding, stretching its limbs and sinking into the earth below. The figure turned, moving towards the door that led deeper into the labyrinth of the house. It knew that it would not have to wait long before the next victims arrived. The house was patient, its call quiet, almost imperceptible, but always there, lurking in the back of the mind. It knew those who were lost, those who felt drawn to the unknown, those who sought what they did not understand. And so, the cycle continued. There was no end to the hunger, no end to the need for souls to wander into its depths. The figure stepped forward, its form shifting slightly, blending into the shadows as it disappeared into the corridors. It moved with purpose, a silent predator in its own domain. The halls stretched before it, endless and winding, but there was no true beginning or end. It was a maze without borders, a prison without bars. The house had no structure in the traditional sense. It was more a living thing, ever shifting, ever changing, feeding on the souls of those who entered. The figure passed through walls with ease, its form like liquid shadow, sliding through the cracks in the house's very foundation. It could feel every pulse, every shift in the structure of the place, every subtle change in the atmosphere. It was as though the house was alive, responding to its presence, communicating with it. The air grew thick, the shadows darker as it moved deeper into the house. It came to a stop at a door that had appeared from nowhere. It was ancient, covered in strange markings that seemed to move and shift like the shadows themselves. The figure's hand reached out, pressing against the cold surface. The door creaked open slowly, and beyond it was a chamber unlike any other. The walls were covered in intricate carvings, symbols that glowed faintly in the darkness. The floor was cracked, uneven, as though it had been disturbed by something immense. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, on top of which lay a book. The figure stepped forward, its eyes locking onto the book. It had been waiting for this moment, for the discovery of the book. This was the source, the key to the house's true power. With a flick of its wrist, the figure lifted the book from its pedestal, feeling the weight of it in its hands. The cover was worn, the pages yellowed with age, but the power within it was unmistakable. The figure opened the book, and as it did, a dark energy surged from its pages, flooding the room. The shadows writhed, pulling at the figure, as if trying to escape the book's power. But the figure held firm, reading the words written in a language long forgotten, a language that resonated deep within the house itself. With each word, the house responded, its walls shuddering, its foundation groaning as if it were alive. The figure closed the book slowly, a look of satisfaction on its face. It knew what needed to be done. It had discovered the secret of the house, the true nature of its power. The book was not just a record of history. It was a map, a guide to controlling the house itself. It held the key to unlocking its full potential. The figure turned and began walking back down the winding corridors, the book now in its grasp. The house seemed to pulse with excitement, the shadows growing thicker as the figure moved. It could feel the power surging through its veins, the hunger beginning to rise again. It would feed once more. The figure entered the main hall, the shadows now swirling around it, as if eager to follow its every command. It felt the energy of the house growing, shifting, responding to its every thought. It raised its hand, and the shadows twisted, stretching, turning into shapes that seemed to grow and shrink at its will. The house was responding. It had accepted the figure as its master. The hunger was endless, and it would never be fully satisfied. But the figure knew that it could control it now. It would feed when it needed to, and it would wait when it chose to. The house was its domain, and it would never let anyone escape again. The doors to the house creaked open, and the air grew heavy with the scent of the outside world. The first of the new souls had arrived, drawn by the pull of the house, unaware of the horrors that awaited them. The figure watched from the shadows, its smile widening as it felt the presence of the new arrivals. They would be the next to feed the house, the next to join the endless cycle. The figure moved forward, its footsteps echoing in the silence. It would ensure that the house would always be hungry, always thirsting for more. And when the time came, it would feast again. The hunger never ceased. The cycle never ended. And the house would always remain. Always. Part 12. The Arrival. The rain outside intensified as the wind howled through the trees. But inside, the air was still, as though the house itself held its breath. The shadows seemed to grow, stretching and twisting in anticipation. The first of the new souls had arrived, and the house was already awake, aware of their presence. They were drawn to it like moths to a flame, unaware of the darkness waiting for them inside. Four figures stood at the doorstep, looking up at the looming structure with a mixture of curiosity and unease. They were strangers to this place, their hearts filled with the thrill of exploration, their minds oblivious to the terror that awaited them. The door creaked open, as though inviting them in, and a chill ran down their spines. A deep, almost imperceptible voice echoed from within, welcoming them in. "Come in, weary travelers," it murmured. "You have arrived at the heart of the storm." They hesitated for only a moment before stepping over the threshold, one by one, drawn by an unknown force. As soon as they crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind them, locking with a sound that echoed through the empty halls. The air grew cold, the shadows darker. The house seemed to close in around them, its walls shifting and groaning like something alive. "Welcome," the voice whispered, its tone soothing yet unsettling. The strangers looked around, their eyes wide with a growing sense of dread. The house was ancient, its walls lined with dark wood, its floors covered in layers of dust. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of their own breathing. One of the figures, a man named Daniel, stepped forward. "Is anyone here?" he called out, his voice trembling slightly. No answer came. Instead, the shadows seemed to move, stretching and twisting along the walls. "We should leave," said Sarah, another of the strangers, her voice tight with fear. "This place doesn't feel right." But it was already too late. The house had begun to awaken, and there was no escape. The figure, still hidden in the depths of the house, watched from the shadows. It had sensed their arrival, felt the pulse of their souls as they crossed the threshold. They were weak, lost, just like the others who had come before them. The hunger had returned. It could feel the familiar pull of the house, urging it to act. The shadows began to shift, swirling around the group, moving closer, surrounding them. The figures tried to move, but the house seemed to grow tighter around them, its walls shifting in ways that defied logic. The air was thick, suffocating, and the temperature dropped even further. "This isn't right," said Sarah, panic rising in her voice. "We need to get out of here." "It's too late," whispered the voice, now closer than before. The shadows seemed to flicker and writhe, forming dark shapes that danced just beyond their vision. The group looked around, their hearts pounding. Something was coming for them, something far older and far more powerful than they could comprehend. The floor beneath their feet groaned, and the sound of footsteps echoed through the halls. It was not their own. "Who's there?" Daniel demanded, his voice shaking. The figure moved closer, its form appearing out of the darkness, tall and ominous. The shadows clung to it like a cloak, and its eyes glowed with an eerie, unnatural light. "You should not have come," the figure said, its voice cold and commanding. "This house belongs to me." The strangers stood frozen, their hearts racing. They could feel the weight of the figure's gaze upon them, the power radiating from it. The air was thick with a suffocating presence, and the walls seemed to press in, narrowing their options. "What is this place?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. The figure smiled, its lips curling in a way that sent a chill through their bones. "This is the heart of all things," it said, "the place where the living and the dead converge." The shadows moved, creeping closer, as if responding to the figure's command. The temperature dropped even further, and the figures began to feel a strange, otherworldly sensation creeping into their bodies. It was as if their very souls were being drawn toward something. "What do you want from us?" Daniel asked, his voice a mixture of fear and defiance. "You are here to feed the hunger," the figure replied, its voice low and guttural. "Just like the others before you." The shadows surged forward, wrapping around the strangers, pulling them toward the darkened center of the house. They struggled, but the shadows were too strong. The walls seemed to close in, the room growing darker and smaller with every passing second. The house was alive, its hunger insatiable. It had been waiting for them. It would never let them leave. The figure stepped closer, its form dissolving into the darkness as it merged with the shadows. It was everywhere now, in the very air they breathed. "This is the price of your curiosity," the figure said, its voice now echoing from all directions. "You have entered my domain, and now you will serve me, as all others have before you." The shadows tightened their grip, dragging them toward the center of the room, where the book now lay. The figure's hand reached out, opening the pages of the book once again, the dark energy flooding the room once more. The house shuddered as if in response. The strangers could feel the pull of the house, the weight of its ancient power settling over them. It was too much. The room grew darker still, the shadows merging together, filling the space until there was nothing left but the darkness. The figure smiled once again. It was time to feed. The darkness enveloped them, smothering their every movement, their every breath. The shadows twisted around their limbs like cold, serpentine tendrils, tightening with every passing second. No escape, no chance. The house had them now. The figure stood motionless, its presence radiating a malevolent calm, watching as the strangers struggled against the suffocating grip of the shadows. It had done this countless times before, feeding on the weak, the curious, those drawn to the allure of the unknown. There was no resistance left in them now. They could feel the pull of the house, the ancient hunger gnawing at the edges of their souls. The house thrummed with life, or rather, with something far darker, an energy that seemed to pulse from the very foundations, resonating with the figure and its will. The walls groaned in unison with the darkness, responding to the figure's silent command. A low, guttural hum began to fill the room, a sound that was both distant and immediate, echoing through the very bones of the house. "This is where it ends," the figure whispered, its voice smooth like velvet, yet carrying the weight of ages. "And where it begins again." The stranger's struggles grew weaker as the shadows grew stronger, twisting and pulling them toward the center of the room. The hunger in the air became palpable, a gnawing, biting thing, the taste of it bitter and cold on their tongues. The house was devouring them, piece by piece. "Please," Sarah gasped, her voice barely audible. "Let us go. We don't belong here." "You never did," the figure replied, its voice a cold echo. "None of you belong here. But now you are part of the house. You are part of me." As it spoke, the shadows tightened, and the room began to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, the walls closing in around them like a trap. They could feel the weight of the house pressing down, squeezing the life out of them. The air was thick with the stench of decay, the oppressive atmosphere making it hard to think, to move. Their breaths were shallow, their bodies growing numb from the lack of oxygen, their limbs heavy as though filled with stone. It was only a matter of time. The house had already taken them, and soon they would join the countless others who had met their end here. In the depths of the darkness, there was a sudden shift, a cold snap of energy that cut through the suffocating atmosphere. The shadows recoiled as if in fear, and the figure stiffened, its head tilting slightly as if listening for something. "What is this?" it whispered, its voice low, filled with sudden uncertainty. A sound, faint at first, then louder, a slow, deliberate knocking at the door. The figure's eyes narrowed, its gaze turning toward the sound. "Another one," it muttered, more to itself than anyone else. The knocking persisted, louder now, followed by the sound of the door creaking under pressure. Something was pushing against it, trying to force its way in. The figure moved, stepping closer to the door, its form dissolving into the shadows as it approached. The knocking stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence that seemed to stretch on forever. The house held its breath. The air crackled with tension. The figure reached the door and placed a hand upon the cold, rotting wood, feeling the vibrations from the other side. A presence, unfamiliar yet undeniable, was pressing against the house. It was unlike anything the figure had felt before. Something ancient, something not of the house's making. The door groaned, and with a sudden surge of force, it burst open. The figure recoiled, its body stiffening in shock. Standing in the doorway, illuminated by the faint glow of the house's dying light, was a figure unlike any other. Tall and gaunt, draped in tattered robes, its face hidden beneath a hood. It was as though the figure had stepped out of another time, another world entirely. The house seemed to shudder at its presence, the shadows flickering and retreating, afraid of the figure's power. For a moment, there was only silence, the tension hanging thick in the air. Then the figure in the doorway spoke, its voice low and resonant, filled with an otherworldly authority. "Release them," it commanded, its tone leaving no room for argument. The figure in the darkness recoiled, its form twisting with an almost animalistic anger. "You have no place here," it hissed, its voice sharp, the shadows around it writhing in agitation. "This is my domain. You cannot take them." The figure in the doorway stepped forward, its presence overwhelming, pushing the shadows back as if they were mere wisps of smoke. "I have come for them," it said, its voice growing more forceful. "And I will take them, whether you like it or not." The tension reached a breaking point as the two figures stood facing one another, their forms locked in an ancient struggle. The shadows in the room recoiled further, the walls trembling as if the very foundations of the house were being torn apart. The strangers, still held in place by the oppressive grip of the darkness, watched in stunned silence. They were powerless, trapped between these two forces, unsure of who to trust or what would happen next. The figure in the doorway raised its hand, and with a single motion, the shadows recoiled, releasing their hold on the strangers. They gasped for breath as the darkness around them began to dissolve, retreating into the corners of the room, no longer able to hold them. The house groaned, its very walls shaking with the force of the unseen battle between the two figures. The air felt lighter, less oppressive, but the sense of danger was far from gone. The figure in the shadows, defeated for the moment, retreated into the darkness, its presence still lingering in the corners of the room. "Go," the figure in the doorway said, its voice softer now, almost gentle. "Leave this place while you still can." The strangers, dazed and shaken, could do nothing but nod. They stumbled toward the door, not daring to look back, as if afraid the house would reclaim them at any moment. As they passed through the door and into the rain-soaked night, they could feel the weight of the house's gaze upon them, the hunger that still lingered in the darkness. But for now, they were free. The figure in the doorway watched them leave, its gaze lingering on the door as it closed behind them. The house had been denied its feast, for now, but the hunger would return. It always did. The rain had not ceased. It fell in torrents, the sound of it echoing through the empty streets, a constant reminder of the darkness that still lingered, just beyond the edges of reality. The strangers, now free from the house, stumbled into the night, their hearts pounding, their bodies exhausted from the terror they had just experienced. They did not speak, could not speak. The weight of what had happened, the horror they had just escaped, was too much for words. As they walked away from the house, each step felt like a release, a movement away from the nightmare that had nearly consumed them. But the sense of dread did not fade. It followed them, as if the very air around them had been tainted by what they had witnessed. The shadows of the house still clung to them, creeping along the edges of their vision, the memory of the figure in the doorway etched into their minds. They did not know where to go, or even if they could find safety. The terror they had felt in the house still lingered in their bones, a chilling presence that refused to let go. As they walked through the downpour, Daniel, who had been leading the group, stopped abruptly. "Wait," he whispered, his voice hoarse and uncertain. The others turned to him, their faces pale and stricken with fear. "What is it?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper, as if speaking too loudly would somehow summon the darkness back upon them. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He stood there, motionless, his eyes darting around, scanning the empty street. Then he spoke again, his voice trembling. "We're not alone." The others turned, their eyes wide with panic, but there was nothing there. The street was empty, save for the rain that soaked the ground, turning the cobblestones into a slick, glistening surface. No one else was in sight. "What are you talking about?" Sarah demanded, her voice edged with fear. Daniel's gaze remained fixed on the shadows ahead. "I can feel it," he said, his voice barely audible over the sound of the rain. "Something is watching us." They stood there, in the cold and damp, the rain beating down on them, feeling the oppressive weight of an unseen presence. It was as though the very air around them had thickened, and every breath they took felt heavier than the last. The shadows that had once been confined to the house now seemed to stretch out, reaching into the night, following them, pressing closer. "We need to keep moving," said Sarah, her voice low and fearful. "We can't stay here." But it was already too late. The temperature dropped suddenly, a chill that cut through their clothes and sank deep into their skin. The sound of the rain seemed to fade, replaced by a deeper silence that hung in the air like a shroud. Then, in the distance, a sound broke the stillness, a faint whisper carried on the wind. They turned in unison, their eyes scanning the darkened street. The whisper grew louder, more distinct, until it was clear. "You can never escape." The voice was cold, distant, yet undeniably close, as though it were right behind them. They spun around, but again, the street remained empty. No one was there. The whispering voice continued, growing louder, as though the very shadows themselves were speaking. "The house has claimed you. You will never be free." Panic surged through them as the shadows around them deepened, stretching and warping unnaturally. The air itself seemed to ripple with the energy of something malevolent, something ancient. "We need to go back," Daniel muttered, his voice a mix of terror and disbelief. "We can't outrun it. We have to go back to the house." Sarah shook her head vehemently, her eyes wide with horror. "No, that's exactly what it wants. We have to keep moving." But the whispering continued, swirling around them, growing louder with each passing second. The shadows stretched farther, swirling in on themselves, until they could feel them closing in. "We cannot escape. We cannot hide. It will always find you." The words repeated in their ears, each one sending a shiver of cold dread through their bones. The house had not been left behind. It was with them, in the very air they breathed, the very shadows that clung to their skin. There was nowhere to run, no place safe enough to hide. The presence of the house was everywhere now. The shadows that stretched across the street seemed to shift and pulse, as if they had a life of their own. The sky above them grew darker, the rain falling harder, until it felt like they were walking through a storm that was not of this world. The streets began to twist and distort, the buildings around them warping as if they were being swallowed by the very earth. Nothing was as it seemed. The reality they had known was slipping away, replaced by something far darker, far more terrifying. The ground beneath their feet cracked and shifted, and the very air began to hum with an unnatural energy. "No," Sarah gasped, her eyes wide with panic. "This isn't real. This can't be happening." But it was happening. They could feel it in every fiber of their being. The suffocating presence of the house, its insatiable hunger pressing in on them from all sides. The shadows that had once seemed distant were now a part of the very world around them, invading every corner, every crevice. They were trapped in the nightmare. It had followed them. "We should never have gone there," Daniel whispered, his voice breaking. "We should never have stepped inside." The street around them continued to twist and warp, the rain falling harder, the shadows deeper, until they could no longer see the familiar landmarks of the town. They were lost. The house was everywhere and nowhere at all. The boundaries between the real and the unreal had shattered. "It's too late," came the voice again, cold and mocking. "You belong to the house now, and it will never let you go." The shadows closed in, and the air grew thick with the scent of decay. The house had come to claim them, and there was no place left to hide. They were already inside. The shadows enveloped them, drawing them deeper into the void, swallowing up everything familiar, everything they had known. The world around them was unrecognizable now, a twisted mockery of the reality they once occupied. The streets had become a maze, their paths warped and bending like a dream that was slipping away, impossible to grasp. The rain no longer fell in torrents, but hung in the air like a suffocating mist, thick and heavy, clinging to their skin and making every breath feel like a struggle. The air itself was stifling, heavy with the scent of mildew and something far darker, something ancient. The figure in the shadows stood watching them, its form a presence that could be felt more than seen. It didn't need to speak. The darkness itself communicated everything it needed to. It was waiting, watching, knowing that they could not escape. "Where are we?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling as she grasped Daniel's arm, her fingers cold and clammy. "This place, it's not real." Daniel didn't respond immediately. He could feel it too, the weight of the air, the oppressive sensation of being trapped. But he didn't know how to answer her. "We're not out of it," he said finally, his voice strained. "The house, it's here. We never left." The words seemed to hang in the air, thick with a terrible truth. They had never truly escaped. The house, the figure, the darkness, it had all followed them. They were still within its reach. The ground beneath them trembled, a faint vibration that seemed to come from the very depths of the earth, a deep, rhythmic pulse that reverberated through their bones. The shadows grew darker, thicker, moving with a life of their own. It was as though the world itself was collapsing in on them, and they were at the center of it. "What do we do now?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We fight," Daniel said, though even he wasn't sure he believed the words. They had no weapons, no means of defense. They were trapped in a nightmare, with no escape, no way out. And the darkness was closing in. The figure in the shadows began to move, its form shifting in the mist, its presence growing stronger, more imposing. It did not need to rush. It was patient. Time meant nothing here. It was always waiting, always hungry. The walls of the world seemed to press in around them, narrowing with every step they took. The streets that had once been wide and open were now claustrophobic, the buildings leaning in, their facades twisted and grotesque. Nothing was right. Nothing was as it should be. "We need to get out," Sarah pleaded, her voice strained, her fear evident in the way her body trembled. "There has to be a way out." But Daniel shook his head. "There isn't. Not anymore. It's too late." The figure was getting closer now, its shape growing clearer in the mist, though its features remained hidden. The air was thick with dread, the shadows pressing in on them from all sides. They could feel the weight of the house in every breath they took, the unyielding presence that refused to let them go. The temperature dropped again, the chill sinking deep into their bones, making it harder to move, harder to think. "It's not just the house," Daniel said, his voice low, filled with a growing sense of realization. "It's something else. Something older. Something that has always been here." Sarah looked at him, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear. "What do you mean?" Daniel didn't answer. Instead, he turned toward the figure, his eyes narrowing as he tried to make sense of the thing that had been stalking them. There was a power to it, something that went beyond the physical. It was as though it existed in a realm outside of time, outside of the world they knew. The whispers began again, soft at first, then growing louder, more insistent. "You cannot escape," they said, over and over. "You belong to us." The shadows rippled around them, the darkness folding and unfolding, like the pages of an ancient book being turned by an unseen hand. They were trapped within its story, each step they took bringing them deeper into the abyss. "What do we do?" Sarah cried, her voice cracking under the weight of her fear. "We have to find a way to stop it," Daniel replied, though his words felt hollow even as he spoke them. There was no solution. They were trapped in the heart of the darkness, surrounded by forces beyond their comprehension. The figure in the shadows stepped closer, its form now fully visible, though its face remained hidden beneath its hood. It was tall, its limbs long and unnaturally thin, its presence suffocating, filling the space around them. "You cannot escape," it said again, its voice low and resonant, carrying the weight of ages. "You are part of the house. You are part of me." The figure reached out, its hand stretching toward them, its fingers elongated and cold, the touch of death itself. The air seemed to freeze as it moved, the very temperature plummeting to levels that were impossible to endure. "No!" Sarah screamed, stumbling backward, but there was no place to run. The shadows surrounded them, closing in from every direction. "We don't belong to you," Daniel shouted, his voice desperate. "We're not part of this." The figure's head tilted slightly, as if considering his words. "You were always a part of it," it said, its voice soft but filled with a terrible certainty. "You were drawn here for a reason. The house called you, and now you will stay." The shadows closed in around them, suffocating them, consuming them, as the figure's hand reached closer, closer. There was no escape, no hope, no salvation. The house had claimed them, and they were lost to it forever. The figure's hand touched Daniel's shoulder, cold as ice, sending a jolt of terror through him. But just as it did, something shifted in the air. A crack, faint but distinct, reverberated through the room. The house trembled. The shadows faltered. For a brief moment, there was a glimmer of something else, something powerful, something that had not been there before. And in that moment, the house seemed to recoil, as if in fear. But before they could react, the darkness surged once more, swallowing everything. The last thing they heard was the voice of the figure, its tone cold and final. "It is done." The darkness enveloped them completely, suffocating and impenetrable, a void that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Daniel and Sarah clung to each other, their breaths shallow, their bodies trembling under the crushing weight of the shadows. The house, or whatever this entity truly was, had bound them, trapping them in a prison where time and reality twisted endlessly, reshaping the world around them into a reflection of pure terror. They couldn't see, couldn't move, couldn't even scream. Their voices felt trapped within their chests, silenced by the overwhelming presence that had taken hold. It was as though they were submerged in a cold, inky abyss, a place where sound and light could not reach. Moments passed, or were they hours? Until something finally shifted. A faint glow, distant and dim, began to appear, cutting through the shadows. The light pulsed gently, like a heartbeat, and seemed to draw them forward, urging them deeper into the darkened space that no longer resembled the house they'd once entered. Despite their fear, the glimmer offered the only escape from the pressing blackness, and they moved toward it with desperate hope. As they walked, the ground beneath them softened, like walking through mud or thick tar. Their steps were slow, each movement dragging them further into an unknown depth. The light grew brighter, revealing faint shapes ahead, distorted, grotesque forms that seemed to writhe and twitch in the dim glow. Sarah gasped as one of the shapes came into focus. A figure bound in place, its form twisted and broken, its face contorted in a silent scream. The light illuminated more of these shapes as they moved closer, and the horror became clear. These were people, or what remained of them, souls trapped, their bodies distorted and fused to the walls around them, their eyes empty yet somehow filled with unspeakable pain. Daniel turned away, unable to look, his stomach twisting with revulsion and fear. "What is this place?" he muttered, though he knew there would be no answer. They moved cautiously, stepping past the trapped figures, feeling the pull of the light ahead. The air grew colder with every step, and the silence around them thickened, pressing in on their minds, filling them with an overwhelming sense of dread. It was as if they were walking into the heart of the darkness itself, the core of whatever entity had ensnared them. The light became blinding, and as they finally reached its source, they froze. Before them stood the figure they had seen in the house, the tall, shrouded entity whose presence had haunted them since they first stepped inside. But now, in the stark glow, they could see its face, a hollow mask devoid of features, a face that was both human and monstrous, a face that seemed to shift and change with each heartbeat. The figure spoke, its voice a low, resonant hum that seemed to reverberate through their very bones. "You have come to the end," it said, its tone devoid of emotion. "You are part of the house now, part of me." Its hand reached out toward them, and this time they could not move, could not turn away. The shadows coiled around them, binding them in place, as the figure's hand touched their foreheads, cold as death, filling them with a sensation so dark and empty that they could hardly breathe. Visions flooded their minds, images of the house through time, of countless others who had entered and never escaped, of souls twisted and bound in eternal darkness. Daniel and Sarah felt their bodies growing heavy, their vision fading, as though they were being pulled into the shadows themselves, absorbed by the house and all its horrors. They struggled, tried to resist, but the pull was too strong, too overwhelming. The house's hunger was insatiable, its desire to consume absolute. They could feel their own memories slipping away, their sense of self dissolving, replaced by the dark, consuming presence of the entity. The last thing they saw was the figure's hollow, shifting face, its empty eyes staring back at them with a cold indifference. And then there was only darkness. The silence was suffocating. Daniel and Sarah were submerged in a void so deep it felt as if they'd been stripped of any essence of themselves, left drifting in a place beyond time and reality. They had no sense of their own bodies now, only an overwhelming emptiness that stretched in all directions, a darkness that pulsed faintly as though it held a heartbeat of its own. And yet, somewhere in the infinite black, a sound began to emerge, a distant, faint whisper that felt as though it was both inside and around them. It was a murmur, indistinct but filled with a chilling familiarity, and it grew louder, echoing through the hollow space, reverberating against their fading thoughts. The hallway stretched before them, impossibly long, seeming to extend forever. There was no light, yet they could see the faint outlines of walls and doors shifting and moving as if they were alive. They walked forward, drawn by an invisible force, each step bringing them deeper into the heart of the house, each breath filling their lungs with a stale, decayed air that carried a hint of something rotten and ancient. As they moved, they noticed the walls began to pulse, like veins carrying some dark energy, and the whispers they had heard in the void returned, louder, more distinct, filling their ears with unintelligible words, fragmented voices from countless souls trapped in the depths of the house. A door appeared to their left, slightly ajar, with a dim light flickering from within. They exchanged a glance, knowing they had no choice but to enter, to see what lay beyond. Daniel pushed the door open, the wood creaking loudly, and they stepped inside. The room was small, empty, but in the center stood a figure they recognized immediately. The shrouded entity, its face still a blank mask, its form twisted and elongated, an unnatural thing that seemed to defy all laws of nature. The figure turned toward them, its empty gaze piercing through the darkness. "You cannot escape," it said, its voice layered, as though 1,000 voices spoke at once. "You belong to the house, to the darkness. There is no way out." Sarah shook her head, taking a step back. "We don't belong here," she whispered, her voice shaking. But the entity's gaze intensified, and suddenly, they felt their bodies grow heavy, their legs weakening as if they were being pulled into the floor, rooted to the spot by some unseen force. The walls of the room began to close in, twisting and bending, the floor beneath them undulating like waves, disorienting them further. It was as though the house itself was rejecting their very existence, forcing them deeper, binding them tighter into its cursed structure. They struggled to move, to break free, but every effort was met with more resistance, an invisible weight pressing down on them, crushing their will. The shadows crept closer, swallowing the walls, the floor, everything around them until they were engulfed in complete blackness again. But now, the darkness felt different. It was alive, breathing, its presence all-encompassing. The whispers returned, louder than ever, filling their minds with an unbearable pressure, fragments of thoughts and emotions from the souls who had come before them, all of them echoing the same despair, the same hopelessness. "You are one of us now," the voices chanted, their tone resigned, filled with a deep sorrow. "You will never leave." The sensation of falling returned, but this time it felt like they were being pulled downward, as though the very ground beneath them had opened up into an endless chasm. The descent was rapid, the darkness swallowing them, deeper and deeper, until they landed in a vast chamber, dimly illuminated by a faint, sickly glow emanating from the walls. All around them were figures, shadowy, distorted forms, their faces twisted in anguish, their hands reaching out as if begging for release. These were the lost souls, the ones the house had claimed, each one trapped in eternal torment, bound to the darkness that had consumed them. Daniel and Sarah backed away, horrified, but they knew there was no escape. The shadows began to move, reaching for them, their cold, skeletal hands stretching out, eager to pull them into the abyss, to make them part of the collective suffering. They tried to scream, but no sound came out. The darkness had taken even their voices, reducing them to silent, helpless witnesses to their own fate. The last thing they saw was the face of the entity, hovering above them, its hollow gaze filled with a cold satisfaction, as though it had finally claimed what it had sought. And then, there was nothing. The darkness became their entire reality, an endless abyss in which time and space held no meaning. There was no sound, no light, only the oppressive weight of an eternity spent in silence, where every fleeting thought and distant memory faded like mist under the sun. Daniel and Sarah were adrift, disembodied, unable to distinguish where one ended and the other began. It was as if their very souls had been stripped of identity, leaving only an endless awareness of their own existence. In that void, any trace of hope or strength seemed impossibly distant, buried under layers of cold, unfeeling shadows. But then, from somewhere far beyond, there was a faint sensation, a ripple in the darkness, almost imperceptible but unmistakably real. It started as a mere flicker, like the faint glimmer of a distant star, and gradually grew in intensity, piercing the oppressive black with a sliver of light. The presence stirred something deep within them, a remnant of will they hadn't known they still possessed. The light was weak, a faint blue glow that seemed to float and waver as if resisting the darkness's pull. But it brought a sensation of warmth, a memory of something that felt like light. As the light grew closer, they could make out a shape within it, a figure standing alone, shrouded in the same faint blue aura. It was neither Daniel nor Sarah, yet its face was familiar, a reflection of the life they had left behind. The figure was fragmented, translucent, as if it were only half real, but it radiated a quiet strength, a calmness that reached them even through the thick blanket of despair. They felt themselves drawn toward it, their minds reaching out like outstretched hands, grasping for something solid amid the endless void. The figure extended its arm, gesturing for them to follow, and as they moved closer, the oppressive darkness around them began to thin, peeling back to reveal a faint outline of what looked like walls, floors, a sense of space beginning to take shape once more. It was the house, their prison, but now distorted, blurred, as if it too were unraveling. Shadows clung to the walls, writhing and shifting, reluctant to release their hold. Yet the figure pressed on, guiding them through twisting corridors and winding staircases that seemed to form and collapse with every step, leading them deeper into the heart of the structure. Daniel could feel his awareness returning, a sense of himself emerging from the numbness, and he tightened his grip on Sarah's hand. She was there, real, her presence anchoring him to the moment. They moved as one, following the figure down a narrow hallway that seemed to stretch into infinity, the walls pressing close on either side, the ceiling low and heavy above them. The whispers returned, louder now, desperate, clawing at their minds as if the house itself was aware of their escape and would do anything to stop them. Finally, the corridor opened into a vast, empty room, its floor covered in a thick layer of dust, the air stale and heavy. At the center of the room stood a door, a simple, unadorned wooden door, but to Daniel and Sarah, it was a beacon, a promise of freedom, a way out. The figure stopped, turning to face them, and though its face remained indistinct, they felt its silent approval, its quiet encouragement. They knew this was their chance, their one opportunity to escape, but the door was still far, and the shadows around them seemed to tighten, pulsing with anger, closing in with renewed ferocity. They ran, their footsteps muffled by the dust, their breaths harsh and ragged, their hearts pounding in unison. The door drew closer, the light around it growing brighter, a golden warmth that pierced the gloom. But with every step, the shadows surged, pulling at them, their hands like claws, their whispers now frantic, insistent, begging them to stay, to join the countless others who had been consumed by the darkness. The closer they got to the door, the stronger the pull of the shadows became, a crushing weight pressing against them, threatening to swallow them whole. With one final surge of strength, Daniel reached out, his fingers grazing the door's cool surface. He could feel its solidity, the reality of it, something tangible in the midst of the nightmare. He gripped the handle, pulling with all his might, and the door swung open, flooding the room with brilliant light that forced the shadows to recoil, shrieking as they melted back into the walls, retreating from the blinding radiance. He and Sarah stumbled forward, crossing the threshold, feeling the weight of the darkness slip from their shoulders as they stepped into the light. As they crossed the threshold, a wave of warmth and blinding light enveloped Daniel and Sarah, pulling them from the oppressive shadows. They blinked, trying to adjust to the brilliance, feeling an unfamiliar sense of relief, like taking their first breaths after nearly drowning. They were out, or so they thought. The surroundings began to come into focus, and they found themselves in an open field beneath a vast, clouded sky, a soft fog rolling across the landscape. Everything was quiet, eerily so, and though it seemed like they were no longer in the house, a gnawing feeling of unease remained in the pit of their stomachs. Daniel glanced around. his eyes searching for any sign of familiarity. The field stretched endlessly in all directions, dotted with tall, dark trees that loomed in the distance like silent sentinels. A strange sense of déjà vu washed over him. Something about this place felt wrong, as if he'd seen it before in a distant memory or a fading dream. Sarah clutched his arm, her grip tight, her face still pale from the ordeal. "Where are we?" she whispered, her voice barely audible in the heavy silence. The words echoed slightly, bouncing off an unseen boundary, as though the field were somehow contained. They began to walk, moving through the thick grass that brushed against their legs, leaving a faint chill in its wake. The fog swirled around them, obscuring their path, and as they moved, the landscape began to shift subtly, trees seeming to appear and disappear in the distance, like shadows flickering on the edge of their vision. They walked for what felt like hours, but the field stretched on and on, unchanged, the horizon always just out of reach. It was as though they were trapped in a looping dream, moving forward but never truly progressing. The silence grew heavier, pressing in on them like an invisible weight, and they began to hear faint sounds, the rustle of leaves, a distant whisper, the echo of footsteps that didn't belong to them. Daniel stopped, turning to look behind them, but the fog had thickened, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. He felt a prickling on the back of his neck, a sensation of being watched, though he could see nothing through the dense mist. "We're not alone here," he muttered, his voice tight with unease. Sarah nodded, her eyes wide, darting from shadow to shadow. As they pressed on, the whispers grew louder, fragments of voices drifting through the fog, overlapping and intertwining in an eerie symphony of despair. The words were indistinct, but the tone was unmistakable. Pleas, warnings, cries for help. It was as if the field were haunted, filled with the lingering echoes of those who had come before, all of them trapped in this endless expanse, searching for an escape that didn't exist. They quickened their pace, desperate to leave the voices behind, but no matter how fast they walked, the whispers followed, growing louder, more insistent. Then, in the distance, they saw it, a faint glow, a warm, golden light cutting through the fog. It beckoned to them, a small beacon in the overwhelming darkness, and without a word, they headed toward it, drawn by the promise of safety, of freedom. The light grew brighter as they approached, revealing a small cottage nestled among the trees, its windows glowing softly, a thin trail of smoke rising from the chimney. It looked inviting, out of place in the eerie landscape, and for a moment, Daniel felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this was the way out, a refuge from the endless expanse. They reached the door, hesitating for a moment before Daniel raised his hand to knock. But before he could, the door creaked open on its own, revealing a cozy interior, warm and inviting, a fire crackling in the hearth. The room was filled with soft, worn furniture, the walls lined with shelves of books and trinkets that seemed to have been collected over lifetimes. A comforting aroma of wood and spices filled the air, and for the first time since entering the house, they felt a sense of calm. They stepped inside, the warmth enveloping them, and the door closed softly behind them, sealing them in. A figure emerged from the shadows, a woman, her face kind yet marked with a sadness that seemed to run deep. She looked at them, her gaze filled with a knowing sympathy, as though she understood exactly what they had endured. "You've come a long way," she said, her voice soft, tinged with sorrow. "But you're not free yet." Daniel and Sarah exchanged a glance, their hearts sinking. The woman gestured for them to sit, and they obeyed, sinking into the soft armchairs by the fire. She watched them in silence for a moment before continuing. "This place you're in, it's not what it seems. It's part of the same darkness that held you before, just another layer, a place between worlds. You escaped one prison, only to find yourself in another. Her words sent a chill down their spines, and Daniel felt a crushing sense of despair. They had thought they were freed, thought they had finally escaped, but the house's hold on them was far from broken. The woman seemed to read his thoughts, her expression softening. "There is a way out," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it requires a sacrifice. A piece of yourself, something that binds you to this world." Sarah's eyes widened, fear flashing across her face. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. The woman looked away, her gaze distant. "This place feeds on souls, on the essence of those who wander too close. It binds them, keeps them here until there's nothing left. To escape, you must give up a part of who you are, something that connects you to your life beyond this realm." Daniel felt a knot of dread in his stomach. He didn't understand what she meant, but the weight of her words hung heavy in the air, filling him with an inexplicable fear. The woman stood, moving to a small table in the corner, where she picked up an old, worn book. She held it out to them, her expression grave. "Inside this book is a ritual, a way to sever the bond that holds you here. But it's dangerous. If you're not careful, it could consume you entirely." They took the book, feeling its weight in their hands, the leather cover cool and worn. The woman gave them a sad smile, as though she'd already accepted her own fate. "I cannot leave this place," she said quietly, "but maybe you can, if you're willing to make the sacrifice." With those words, she faded back into the shadows, leaving them alone in the quiet warmth of the cottage, the book heavy in their hands, its contents a mystery yet to be unveiled. Sitting alone by the flickering fire, Daniel and Sarah stared at the ancient book resting on the table between them. The room was quiet, the warmth of the cottage comforting yet heavy with the gravity of the woman's words. Sarah reached for the book, her fingers trembling slightly as she ran them over the worn leather cover. She glanced at Daniel, her eyes dark with uncertainty. "Are we really going to do this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible in the silence. Daniel took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on the flames dancing in the hearth. He knew they didn't have much of a choice. They had come too far, endured too much to turn back now. The weight of the decision pressed down on him, suffocating, yet there was a flicker of determination deep within, a spark that refused to let go. "If this is the only way out," he said slowly, "then we have to try. We can't stay trapped here forever." With a nod, Sarah opened the book, the brittle pages crackling as they turned. The text was faded, written in a language neither of them recognized, but the symbols and illustrations seemed to convey a dark, primal power. The ritual described was complex, intricate, requiring a precise series of steps to sever their connection to this realm. They would each have to surrender something deeply personal, something that bound them to the life they had left behind. A memory, a fragment of their soul, a sacrifice to appease the forces that held them captive. They read through the instructions carefully, their hearts pounding as they absorbed the gravity of what was required. The ritual called for them to light a fire in the hearth, using specific herbs and symbols drawn from their blood. Each step was a test, a trial meant to weaken their resistance, to wear down their defenses until they were vulnerable enough to make the final offering. It was dangerous, the woman had warned, and any mistake could trap them forever, their souls lost to the shadows. As they prepared, gathering the necessary items, the atmosphere in the cottage grew tense, charged with an almost electric energy. The shadows seemed to lengthen, stretching across the walls, as if watching, waiting, anticipating the outcome. Daniel could feel a prickle of fear crawling up his spine, but he pushed it down, focusing on the task at hand. They had to be strong, precise. There was no room for error. When everything was ready, they sat side by side before the hearth, a circle of symbols drawn in blood surrounding them. When everything was ready, they sat side by side before the hearth, a circle of symbols drawn in blood surrounding them. The fire crackled softly, its warmth seeping into their bones, yet it felt wrong, tainted, as though it too were part of the darkness that held them captive. Sarah took a deep breath, steadying herself before looking at Daniel, her eyes resolute. "I'll go first," she said, her voice firm. He nodded, watching as she closed her eyes, focusing on the memory she had chosen to sacrifice. It was a small, innocent memory, a fragment of her childhood, a moment filled with light and laughter. But it was precious, a piece of her identity, a part of who she was. She whispered the incantation, her voice trembling, and as she did, a faint glow emanated from her, a soft, pulsing light that grew stronger as she surrendered the memory. It floated into the fire, merging with the flames, which flared briefly before returning to their steady crackle. Sarah opened her eyes, a single tear slipping down her cheek. She looked dazed, disoriented, as though a part of her had been ripped away, leaving a hollow ache in its place. Daniel reached for her hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze before steeling himself for his own sacrifice. He closed his eyes, focusing on a memory of his own, a cherished moment, one he had clung to through countless dark days. He felt the loss keenly as he let it go, the memory slipping from his mind, fading into a blur before vanishing completely. The fire accepted his offering, flaring brightly as it consumed the fragments of their souls, and a deep, resonant hum filled the room, vibrating through the walls and floor, shaking the very foundation of the cottage. They clung to each other, fear rising as the ritual reached its climax, the shadows around them shifting, swirling in response to the energy building within the circle. The air grew thick, oppressive, and for a moment they couldn't breathe, their lungs burning, their vision blurring as the darkness pressed in, smothering, relentless. Then, just as suddenly, the pressure lifted, the air clearing, and they felt a shift, a crack in the fabric of the reality that held them captive. A doorway began to form within the circle, a shimmering portal that flickered like a mirage, offering a glimpse of the world beyond. They could see faint outlines of trees, the soft glow of moonlight filtering through, and a rush of hope surged within them, a desperate yearning for freedom. Without a word, they stood, stepping toward the portal, their hands still clasped tightly together. The shadows around them hissed, recoiling from the light, but they could feel their pull weakening, the power that had held them bound finally beginning to release. With one last look back at the cottage, they stepped through the portal, the darkness peeling away like layers of old paint, leaving them standing in the open air, the cool night breeze washing over them. They were free. The forest stretched out before them, vast and silent under the pale glow of the moon. For a moment, they simply stood there, breathing in the crisp, fresh air, savoring the feel of the earth beneath their feet. But as they looked around, they realized something was wrong. The trees were twisted, gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands, and the air was thick with an unnatural stillness, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. They weren't in the world they remembered. The forest felt alien, hostile, the darkness around them thick and impenetrable, as though they had merely traded one prison for another. Daniel's heart sank, a cold dread creeping over him as he realized the truth. They had escaped the house, but the world they had entered was tainted, corrupted by the same darkness that had bound them. The shadows had followed them, lurking just beyond the edge of the trees, waiting, watching. He turned to Sarah, his hand tightening around hers as a new resolve settled within him. They might not be free yet, but they had each other, and as long as they were together, they would keep fighting, keep searching for a way back to the world they had lost. The darkness was vast, relentless, but they had proven they could endure, that they could resist. And as they stepped forward, moving deeper into the twisted forest, they carried with them the faint hope that somewhere, somehow, there was still a way out. Daniel and Sarah moved cautiously through the twisted forest, each step accompanied by the quiet rustling of leaves underfoot. The air was thick, carrying a scent of decay and damp earth, an unsettling reminder that they were far from home. The moonlight struggled to pierce the canopy above, casting only faint, silvery beams that illuminated their path just enough to navigate the dense woods. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of branches or distant, indiscernible whispers that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. As they walked, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The shadows among the trees seemed to shift, elongate, as though something or someone was lurking just beyond their sight. He tried to ignore the growing tension, but every instinct in him screamed that they were not alone. He glanced at Sarah, her face drawn and pale, yet determined, her gaze fixed on the path ahead. She had become his anchor in this nightmare, a steady presence in the sea of darkness that threatened to consume them both. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows ahead, blocking their path. It was a tall, thin man with hollow eyes and a twisted smile that sent a chill down their spines. He was draped in tattered, dark robes that seemed to blend seamlessly with the shadows, and his skin had an unnatural pallor, almost translucent in the faint moonlight. The man regarded them with a look of amusement, as though he had been expecting them. "Lost, are we?" His voice was a whisper, barely audible, yet it resonated through the silence, filling the air with an unsettling weight. Daniel tightened his grip on Sarah's hand, his heart pounding. "Who are you?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The man's smile widened, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too long. "Names are inconsequential in a place like this," he said, "but you may call me the Keeper. I am the caretaker of this realm, the guardian of those who wander too far from the light." Sarah shivered, her eyes narrowing. "We don't belong here. We just want to go home." The Keeper's laughter was soft, a haunting sound that echoed through the trees. "Ah, but you crossed the threshold willingly, made your sacrifices. You are bound to this place now, like all the others who have tried to escape the darkness." He gestured to the trees around them, and as they looked closer, they realized that the twisted shapes weren't branches at all. They were figures, shadowy forms entangled in the trunks, their faces frozen in expressions of agony and despair. The forest was filled with them, souls trapped in an eternal prison, bound to the very fabric of the twisted world they had entered. A wave of horror washed over them, and Daniel took a step back, his mind racing. Was this to be their fate as well? To become part of the shadows, lost forever in the darkness? He felt Sarah's grip tighten on his arm, grounding him, giving him strength. "We're not staying here," he said firmly, his voice filled with a resolve he hadn't known he possessed. "There has to be a way out." The Keeper's smile faded, his expression shifting to one of cold, calculating malice. "There is always a price, Daniel," he said softly, his hollow eyes gleaming. "To leave this place, you must give up something precious, something that defines you. Are you prepared to pay the cost?" Daniel's mind raced, the weight of the choice pressing down on him. They had already sacrificed memories, fragments of themselves. But this felt different. The keeper's gaze bore into him, as though he could see into the very depths of his soul, searching for something he could use, something he could take. Sarah looked at Daniel, her face pale but determined. "We've come this far. We can't give up now." The keeper stepped aside, gesturing toward a narrow path that wound deeper into the forest, the darkness pressing in on either side. "Very well," he said, his voice a chilling whisper. "Follow this path, and perhaps you will find what you seek. But remember, every step you take binds you further to this place. There is no turning back." They hesitated for only a moment before stepping onto the path, their hands still tightly clasped. The keeper watched them go, his hollow eyes gleaming with something that might have been amusement, or perhaps hunger. They could feel his gaze on them as they moved deeper into the forest, the weight of his presence lingering like a shadow in the back of their minds. The path twisted and turned, leading them through thickets of thorny bushes and past towering ancient trees whose branches seemed to reach out, grasping at them as they passed. The air grew colder, and the whispers grew louder, filling their minds with fragmented voices, echoes of past lives and forgotten memories. It was as if the forest itself were alive, feeding on their fear, their hope, their very souls. At last, they reached a clearing, and in the center stood an altar carved from dark stone, its surface etched with symbols that seemed to pulse with a faint, eerie light. The ground around it was littered with bones, remnants of those who had come before, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. They knew instinctively that this was the heart of the forest, the place where the veil between worlds was thinnest. The altar seemed to call to them, a silent whisper that resonated in their minds, urging them forward. They approached cautiously, their footsteps echoing in the stillness, and as they drew closer, they felt a strange pulsing energy emanating from the stone. It was ancient, powerful, and it seemed to recognize them, to hunger for them. A deep, rumbling voice echoed in their minds, filling the clearing with a sense of foreboding. "To escape, you must offer me a piece of your souls," it said. "Only then will the path open, and you will be free." Daniel and Sarah exchanged a glance, the weight of the choice pressing down on them. They had already sacrificed so much, and yet the darkness demanded more, an unending hunger that threatened to consume them whole. But there was no other way. If they wanted to leave, they would have to pay the price. Daniel stepped forward, his voice steady. "We accept." The air grew thick, charged with an otherworldly energy as they placed their hands on the altar, feeling its cold, rough surface beneath their fingers. A sharp pain shot through them, searing into their minds as the altar drank from their souls, drawing out fragments of their memories, their identities, pieces of who they were. It was excruciating, the loss cutting deeper than any physical wound, leaving them feeling hollow, diminished. But as the pain faded, they felt a shift, a soft crack in the fabric of the world around them. A shimmering portal appeared before them, flickering with a faint, silvery light. It was their way out, the path they had fought so hard to find. With one last glance at each other, they stepped through the portal, leaving the twisted forest behind. The shadows clung to them, reluctant to let go, but they pushed forward, the light growing brighter as they moved, until finally they emerged into the world beyond. They stood in silence, the cool night air washing over them. A sense of relief mingled with the lingering ache of all they had lost. The darkness was behind them, but they knew they would never be the same. They had escaped, but a part of them would always remain bound to that twisted realm, a fragment of their souls lost to the shadows forever. When everything was ready, they sat side by side before the hearth, a circle of symbols drawn in blood surrounding them. The fire crackled softly, its warmth seeping into their bones, yet it felt wrong, tainted, as though it too were part of the darkness that held them captive. Sarah took a deep breath, steadying herself before looking at Daniel, her eyes resolute. "I'll go first," she said, her voice firm. He nodded, watching as she closed her eyes, focusing on the memory she had chosen to sacrifice. It was a small, innocent memory, a fragment of her childhood, a moment filled with light and laughter. But it was precious, a piece of her identity, a part of who she was. She whispered the incantation, her voice trembling, and as she did, a faint glow emanated from her, a soft, pulsing light that grew stronger as she surrendered the memory. It floated into the fire, merging with the flames, which flared briefly before returning to their steady crackle. Sarah opened her eyes, a single tear slipping down her cheek. She looked dazed, disoriented, as though a part of her had been ripped away, leaving a hollow ache in its place. Daniel reached for her hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze before steeling himself for his own sacrifice. He closed his eyes, focusing on a memory of his own, a cherished moment, one he had clung to through countless dark days. He felt the loss keenly as he let it go, the memory slipping from his mind, fading into a blur before vanishing completely. The fire accepted his offering, flaring brightly as it consumed the fragments of their souls, and a deep, resonant hum filled the room, vibrating through the walls and floor, shaking the very foundation of the cottage. They clung to each other, fear rising as the ritual reached its climax, the shadows around them shifting, swirling in response to the energy building within the circle. The air grew thick, oppressive, and for a moment, they couldn't breathe, their lungs burning, their vision blurring as the darkness pressed in, smothering, relentless. Then, just as suddenly, the pressure lifted, the air clearing, and they felt a shift, a crack in the fabric of the reality that held them captive. A doorway began to form within the circle, a shimmering portal that flickered like a mirage, offering a glimpse of the world beyond. They could see faint outlines of trees, the soft glow of moonlight filtering through, and a rush of hope surged within them, a desperate yearning for freedom. Without a word, they stood, stepping toward the portal, their hands still clasped tightly together. The shadows around them hissed, recoiling from the light, but they could feel their pull weakening, the power that had held them bound finally beginning to release. With one last look back at the cottage, they stepped through the portal, the darkness peeling away like layers of old paint, leaving them standing in the open air, the cool night breeze washing over them. They were free. The forest stretched out before them, vast and silent under the pale glow of the moon. For a moment, they simply stood there, breathing in the crisp, fresh air, savoring the feel of the earth beneath their feet. But as they looked around, they realized something was wrong. The trees were twisted, gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands, and the air was thick with an unnatural stillness, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. They weren't in the world they remembered. The forest felt alien, hostile, the darkness around them thick and impenetrable, as though they had merely traded one prison for another. Daniel's heart sank, a cold dread creeping over him as he realized the truth. They had escaped the house, but the world they had entered was tainted, corrupted by the same darkness that had bound them. The shadows had followed them, lurking just beyond the edge of the trees, waiting, watching. He turned to Sarah, his hand tightening around hers as a new resolve settled within him. They might not be free yet, but they had each other, and as long as they were together, they would keep fighting, keep searching for a way back to the world they had lost. The darkness was vast, relentless, but they had proven they could endure, that they could resist. and as they stepped forward, moving deeper into the twisted forest, they carried with them the faint hope that somewhere, somehow, there was still a way out. Daniel and Sarah moved cautiously through the twisted forest, each step accompanied by the quiet rustling of leaves underfoot. The air was thick, carrying a scent of decay and damp earth, an unsettling reminder that they were far from home. The moonlight struggled to pierce the canopy above, casting only faint, silvery beams that illuminated their path just enough to navigate the dense woods. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of branches or distant, indiscernible whispers that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. As they walked, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The shadows among the trees seemed to shift, elongate, as though something or someone was lurking just beyond their sight. He tried to ignore the growing tension, but every instinct in him screamed that they were not alone. He glanced at Sarah, her face drawn and pale, yet determined, her gaze fixed on the path ahead. She had become his anchor in this nightmare, a steady presence in the sea of darkness that threatened to consume them both. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows ahead, blocking their path. It was a tall, thin man with hollow eyes and a twisted smile that sent a chill down their spines. He was draped in tattered, dark robes that seemed to blend seamlessly with the shadows, and his skin had an unnatural pallor, almost translucent in the faint moonlight. The man regarded them with a look of amusement, as though he had been expecting them. When Daniel and Sarah stepped through the portal, the world they returned to felt colder, sharper. The air smelled different, carrying a crispness they hadn't felt in what seemed like an eternity. They took deep breaths, savoring the freedom, but as they glanced around, they noticed subtle, unsettling differences. They were in a forest, but it wasn't the same forest they had known before. The trees stood tall and straight, their branches bare and reaching skyward, casting long shadows in the moonlight. A deep silence permeated the area, thick and heavy, as though the world itself were holding its breath. Sarah felt a pang of discomfort, an unshakable sense that they had not fully escaped. She turned to Daniel, her voice a whisper in the stillness. "Is it really over? Are we truly out?" Daniel's face was drawn and tense, his eyes scanning their surroundings as if trying to make sense of their new reality. "We're out of the forest," he said slowly, "but I don't know if we're home." They began walking, following a narrow path that wound through the trees, their footsteps muffled by the soft ground. The forest seemed endless, stretching on with no sign of civilization. The silence grew oppressive, each step echoing in their ears, amplified by the weight of their isolation. Daniel tried to push down the gnawing fear that crept into his mind, but it lingered, an insidious reminder that they weren't truly safe. As they walked, shadows flickered in the corners of their vision, small, fleeting shapes that seemed to dart between the trees, moving in silence. They were too quick to be caught in full view, but the sensation of being watched returned, stronger than ever. Sarah's skin prickled, a chill settling over her as she sensed the invisible eyes that followed their every move. They kept moving, unwilling to give in to the fear, but the tension in the air grew thicker, the silence broken only by the occasional crunch of leaves beneath their feet. After what felt like hours, they emerged from the forest into an open field, the moon hanging high above, casting its silvery light over the landscape. In the distance, they could see the faint outline of a small town, its lights flickering like tiny stars against the darkness. Relief washed over them, and they quickened their pace, the sight of civilization bringing a renewed sense of hope. As they neared the town, they could make out the shapes of houses, old and worn but welcoming, their warm lights promising safety and rest. But as they entered the outskirts, something felt off. The streets were empty, devoid of any signs of life. The silence persisted, thick and unnatural, wrapping around them like a shroud. They moved cautiously through the town, their footsteps echoing against the cobblestone streets. The houses were dark, their windows like hollow eyes staring out into the night. Sarah felt her heart rate quicken, her senses heightened as she scanned the empty doorways and shadowed alleyways. It was as though the town had been abandoned, left to decay under the weight of an unspoken curse. As they passed by a small shop, its windows dusty and cracked, Sarah noticed something strange. Inside, on a dusty shelf, lay an old photograph, a faded black and white image of two figures standing side by side. She squinted, her heart skipping a beat as she recognized the faces in the picture. It was them, Daniel and Sarah, frozen in time, their expressions blank, their eyes empty. She grabbed Daniel's arm, her voice barely a whisper. "Look, that's us." Daniel's face drained of color as he stared at the photograph, his mind reeling. How was it possible? They had never been here before, never set foot in this town. Yet there they were, captured in a moment they couldn't remember, their faces hauntingly familiar yet disturbingly vacant. A chill ran down his spine, and he pulled Sarah away from the window, his voice tight with unease. "We need to keep moving. This place, it's wrong." They continued down the street, their pace quickening as the sense of unease grew. Shadows shifted in the corners of their vision, moving with unnatural speed, and the silence became suffocating, as though the very air were pressing down on them, thick and heavy with unseen malice. Every instinct screamed at them to leave, to run, but the town seemed to close in around them, each step feeling like a descent into a dark, twisted nightmare. They reached a small church at the center of the town, its doors slightly ajar, revealing a flickering candlelight within. The sight of the light drew them in, a beacon in the darkness, and they pushed the doors open, stepping into the cold, stone sanctuary. The room was empty, save for a single candle on the altar, its flame dancing in the shadows. The air was stale, carrying the scent of old wood and wax, mingled with something faintly metallic. As they approached the altar, they noticed a book lying open, its pages filled with strange symbols and runes. The writing was familiar, echoing the symbols they had seen in the forest, and an overwhelming sense of dread washed over them. It was as if the book had been left there for them, a final piece of the puzzle that had brought them to this place. Daniel reached for the book, his fingers brushing the brittle pages. As he touched it, a sudden wave of memories flooded his mind. Fragmented images, whispers of voices, faces he didn't recognize. He could feel the weight of those who had come before, those who had been trapped, bound to this town, their souls woven into its very fabric. They were prisoners, shadows of themselves, and now he understood that they, too, were part of this cursed place. The realization hit him like a physical blow, and he staggered back, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "Sarah, we're not free. We're still trapped." Sarah's face was pale, her eyes wide with horror as the truth dawned on her. The town, the photograph, the book, it was all part of the same darkness that had followed them, an endless cycle of despair that held them captive. They hadn't escaped. They had merely crossed into another layer of the nightmare, one that wore the guise of freedom but hid a deeper, more insidious trap. Desperation clawed at them, a frantic need to escape, but as they turned to leave, the doors of the church slammed shut, sealing them inside. The candle flickered wildly, its flame growing, stretching, until it cast a towering shadow that loomed over them, a dark figure that seemed to pulse with malice. The shadow moved closer, its form shifting, changing, until it took on the appearance of the keeper, his hollow eyes glinting with cruel amusement. "You thought you could escape," he whispered, his voice echoing in the empty sanctuary. "But there is no escape from the darkness. You are bound to this place, just as those before you were. You are part of the cycle now, woven into the fabric of this cursed town." Daniel and Sarah backed away, their minds racing, but there was nowhere to go. The shadows closed in around them, pressing in with a suffocating weight, and they could feel the cold, relentless pull of the darkness, drawing them deeper, binding them to the town's curse. In a final, desperate act, they grasped each other's hands, clinging to the last shred of hope, the bond that had carried them through so much. But as the darkness enveloped them, they felt their grip loosen, their memories fading, their identities dissolving, until they were nothing more than shadows, echoes of the lives they had once lived. And outside, in the quiet, empty streets of the forgotten town, two new figures appeared in a faded photograph, their faces blank, their eyes vacant, frozen in time, a haunting reminder of those who had tried and failed to escape. Time had no meaning in the cursed town, where the boundaries between reality and nightmare blurred beyond recognition. The endless cycle continued, and yet, in the deepest corners of the forsaken place, something had changed. The shadows grew restless, their whispers rising to a low murmur as if anticipating a shift in the balance. For so long, the town had remained trapped in its endless loop of forgotten souls, but the presence of Daniel and Sarah had altered something, their struggles leaving a mark on the fabric of the dark realm. The town stood silent once more, its empty streets bathed in the cold light of the moon, its buildings still and desolate. The church at the heart of the town was once again silent, the altar untouched, the candle flickering with its usual weak light. But the air was different, thick with an unnatural weight, like the calm before a storm. In the distance, beyond the town's borders, the forest loomed. The trees were black silhouettes against the starless sky, stretching like jagged fingers toward the horizon. The oppressive silence weighed heavily on everything, and the path that Daniel and Sarah had taken, that brief escape they thought they had found, had faded into nothingness. The forest, it seemed, had consumed their hopes, swallowing them whole, leaving only remnants behind. Memories that had long since faded, identities that had been erased. And then, as if from nowhere, a figure appeared in the distance. It was difficult to make out at first, just a shadow against the darkness, but as it drew closer, it became clear. A man, tall and imposing, with hollow eyes that shimmered faintly in the moonlight. His skin, pale and stretched tight over his bones, was a ghostly reflection of the keeper. Yet this figure was different. Somehow, there was no malicious grin on his face, no cruel amusement in his eyes. He was tired. The weight of countless years had worn him down, leaving only a faint trace of the person he had once been. The figure walked with purpose, his steps slow but sure. He did not seem to notice the shadows that clung to the buildings, nor the faint whispers that swirled around him. He walked as if guided by something, an invisible force that beckoned him forward. He reached the church at the center of the town, pausing in front of the doors as if contemplating them for a long moment. His hands, long and thin, reached out and pushed the doors open, revealing the empty sanctuary within. But this time, the candle on the altar flickered in a different way. Its flame was stronger, more vibrant, almost alive. And for a brief moment, the shadows in the church seemed to shrink back, as though afraid of what was about to happen. The figure stepped inside, his movements deliberate and calm. He approached the altar and, without hesitation, placed his hands upon the book that lay there. The strange symbols and runes on its pages shimmered faintly as if recognizing the presence of someone who had touched it before, someone who had once been part of the cycle. He turned the pages slowly, his eyes scanning the ancient text, and with each word, the air in the church grew heavier, the atmosphere thick with a sense of inevitability. The echoes of the past, of those who had come before, began to stir, their memories awakening as if in response to the man's presence. They whispered in the dark corners of the church, their voices like a distant chant, rising in a crescendo. For a moment, everything stopped. The air became still, the whispers dying down as if holding their breath. And then, in the quiet darkness, the man spoke. Enough. The word reverberated through the church, filling the space with a power that seemed to break the very silence. The shadows recoiled, the candle flame flickered violently, and the ground beneath his feet trembled. The book on the altar pulsed with light, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the oppressive weight of the curse seemed to lift. The figure closed the book, his hand lingering over the symbols for a brief moment before he turned away from the altar. The darkness around him began to retreat, and the town itself seemed to shudder as if waking from a long, terrible slumber. The figures that had once been trapped in the trees, the souls bound to the town, began to stir. Their forms, once twisted and broken, now seemed more whole, more human. They blinked in the sudden light, confused and disoriented, but free. The man stood in the center of the church, watching as the town transformed before his eyes. The decay, the shadows, the suffocating silence, they were fading. The buildings began to regain their color, the streets took on a life of their own, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted as if something ancient had been undone. For the first time in countless years, the town felt alive again, and yet something was different. The man had broken the cycle, but at what cost? As the light of the moon bathed the town in a pale glow, he turned toward the door, his eyes still vacant, his face reflecting a profound sadness. His journey had come to an end, but the memories of those who had suffered before him would not be forgotten. He stepped into the night, disappearing into the distance as the town behind him began to breathe again, its curse lifted, its ghosts freed. But in the stillness of the night, if one listened closely, they could hear the faintest whisper, carried by the wind, an echo of those who had wandered too far, too deep, and a reminder that some darkness can never truly be escaped. And as the town settled into its newfound peace, the only sound that remained was the gentle rustling of the leaves in the trees, and the distant call of an owl in the night.